Chapter 346. As a large amount of vitality, spiritual vigor, and traces of space power continued to pour in, the huge eye that was tightly shut finally opened slowly. The pupils of the enormous eye were pitch black, as unfathomable as an abyss. Even the holy lords at the peak of the divine ruin realm present felt goosebumps all over their bodies when they saw the eye of the demon god open. Boom! A terrifying aura burst forth, and layers of the void froze as if a supreme expert was awakening, opening his eyes and looking at the mortal world. This is the demon god's eye? The grand beginning divine lord's face was solemn, and so were the other divine lords. The aura of the demon god's eye's awakening was too terrifying, and the divine power that could shatter everything made the divine lords feel as if they were facing a true supreme expert. Of course, the divine lords understood that this should be an illusion. Even if a supreme expert's life treasure was fully awakened, it would only be close to a supreme expert, let alone the demon god's eye. Although the demon god's eye was jointly refined by the supreme experts, it was not an offensive treasure, and the power it produced was naturally not comparable to a life treasure. It's said that this demon god's eye was refined by a few supreme powerhouses by imitating the demon god of the cave world. It can't be compared to the power of a demon god when he truly opens his eyes. The lunar holy master took a deep breath and said solemnly, "More than 10,000 years ago, a certain demon god in the depths of the cave world merely opened his eyes and looked at the human world from a different world, yet countless powerhouses of the human race had fallen, and even the strongest powerhouses had been severely injured. How could such power be compared to a mere treasure?" The reason why the supreme experts refined this demon god's eye together was that they wanted to look up at the height of the demon god, and not really to replicate the attack when the demon god opened his eyes. Alright. The demon god's eye has been activated, the sect master of the heavenly blade mountain said word by word. As soon as he finished speaking, under the huge eye, images suddenly appeared. The images moved from far to near, and instantly traversed the entire immortal gate, then crossed layers of void, and finally landed on a huge ancient stone gate. That is the entrance to the mortal world. The valley master of the wind god valley's eyes lit up. The connection between the immortal gate and the mortal world was the huge ancient stone gate. It was because of this stone gate that the small world in the immortal gate could be tightly locked to the mortal world. Otherwise, there was no up, down, left, or right in the depths of the void, and the small world in the immortal gate would have been lost in the layers of void after 10,000 years. The next moment, under the watchful gazes of the sacred masters, the demon god's eye's line of sight passed through the stone door and looked at the human great world. On the other side, Su Qin's breakthrough has also reached a critical moment. Whoosh! The countless divine pills and spirit liquids placed in front of Su Qin collapsed and turned into endless essence qi and spirit vigor, which merged into his body. At this moment, Su Qin was no longer satisfied with swallowing the pills one by one. He absorbed the pressure of all the pills in an instant to help himself break through the shackles and enter a higher level. If there were other people present, they would be shocked to find that the pills in front of Su Qin were divine pills and spirit liquids that were rarely seen in hundreds or thousands of years. Even an earth immortal would be overjoyed to get one. However, they were piled up in front of Su Qin like jelly beans, and a small mountain would disappear after a while. But even so, after a hill disappeared, another hill appeared. It was as if there was no end to it, and it was endlessly sucked into Su Qin's body. In the end, even pills couldn't satisfy Su Qin anymore. A vast ocean appeared silently in the sky above Chang'an City. It was the Essence Qi Ocean in the depths of the void. As soon as the shadow of the Essence Qi Ocean appeared, a large amount of extremely pure Essence Qi leaked and poured into the underground of Chang'an City, into Su Qin's body. The phenomenon that appeared in the sky above Chang'an City immediately attracted the attention of countless people in Chang'an City. What's that? From the looks of it, it looks like the sea. Are you an idiot? Why would the sea appear in the sky? Many people in Chang'an City stared at it with their eyes wide open and kept talking. Compared to the puzzlement of the citizens, a small number of myth realm martial artists had a storm raging in their hearts. This is the Essence Qi Ocean? Isn't the Essence Qi Ocean hidden in the depths of the void? How could it appear? Is someone going to become an earth immortal? That's not right. In the records of my sect, when a peak myth realm martial artist became an earth immortal, there was no such phenomenon. The myth realm martial artists from the major sects were in disbelief. Many of the major sects overseas were basically related to earth immortals. They probably knew what would happen when a myth realm martial artist broke through to the earth immortal realm. In the records of these major sects, when a myth realm martial artist entered the earth immortal realm, only his primordial spirit merged with the essence chi ocean, and then drew a small part of the power of the essence chi ocean to replenish his body. After all, with the body of a myth realm martial artist, he could at most absorb a small part of the power of the essence chi ocean. Otherwise, if it exceeded a certain limit, the body would not be able to bear it and would directly explode. But now the shadow of the essence chi ocean that appeared in the sky above Chang and city was vast and mighty. It was nearly 500 miles long, and this was called a small part? Could it be that the celestial of the empire of Tang has broken through again? A myth realm martial artist asked cautiously. As soon as this was said, the rest of the myths were shocked. Although a myth realm martial artist wanted to refute, the words were on the tip of his tongue, but he could no longer say it. Because other than this explanation that could explain what was happening, no one could think of any other possibility. The celestial of Tang Guotian is already invincible in the world. Now that he has broken through again, what level has his strength reached? An old man in cotton clothes sighed softly. The rest of the myths looked at each other and did not speak. They just silently looked at the shadow of the essence chi ocean that was nearly 500 miles long above Chang and city. The scene in front of them had completely exceeded the limit of their imagination. These myths did not even have the qualifications to look up to Su Qin. How could they know how strong Su Qin was? However, although they did not know, it did not affect their observation of the essence chi ocean. One must know that the essence chi ocean was only accessible to peak myths and earth immortals. Now that it suddenly appeared in the human world, it was simply a rare opportunity for them. If by virtue of this experience, they had some understanding of the essence chi ocean, wouldn't the possibility of breaking through to the earth immortal realm increase by a little? Besides, even if there was no improvement at all, it could be used to broaden their horizons. Anyway, they did not need to pay anything, so why not? At this moment, inside the East Palace, in front of the Right Spring Square in Fairy, who was sitting cross-legged with her eyes closed, suddenly opened her eyes. Master is going to step into the Divine Ruins realm? Tyene Fairy saw the vast essence chi ocean that was nearly 500 miles long appear. Although she was shocked, she could barely accept it. As the saintess-to-be of the Tyene Holy Land, one of the 6 great holy lands in the Immortal sect, Tyene Fairy naturally knew that a breakthrough in the Earth Immortal realm would cause the essence chi ocean to appear again. Of course, the breakthrough here referred to the crossing of a large realm, such as breaking through from the spirit severing stage to the origin returning stage, and from the origin returning stage to the divine ruins, not from the early spirit severing stage to the middle spirit severing stage. Although it is only a matter of time for the direct descendants of Master or even the strongest to step into the divine ruins realm, Master is not even 500 years old. Tyene Fairy was still in disbelief. According to the ancient records of the Tyene Holy Land, once the descendants of the strongest awakened their bloodline, they would advance by leaps and bounds and step into the divine ruins realm. This was also the reason why the direct descendants of the strongest were above the earth immortals who were at the peak of the divine ruins realm. However, success and failure depended on bloodline. Throughout the several essence chi recovery eras, almost no direct descendants of the strongest were able to break through the shackles, shatter the void, and become the strongest. Even if the direct descendants of the strongest grew to the limit, they would only be close to the strongest. Of course, this could not cover up the strength of the direct descendants of the strongest. After all, how many of the countless living beings in the world could become the strongest? That's not right. Master is not stepping into the divine ruins realm. Suddenly, Tyene Fairy seemed to have discovered something, and her eyes suddenly widened. According to the ancient records of the 6 great holy lands in the Immortal sect, when the origin returning stage Earth Immortal broke through to the divine ruins realm, the essence chi ocean that appeared was at least 500 miles long. But now the essence chi ocean that appeared above Chang and city was only close to 500 miles long, but in fact it was only 490 miles long. It was still a little short of 500 miles. In other words, Su Qin's breakthrough was not from the origin returning stage to the divine ruins realm, but from the spirit dividing stage to the origin returning stage. Realizing this, Taiyin Fairy was dumbfounded. Her mind went blank. She was so shocked that she could not recover from it. Taiyin Fairy couldn't imagine that Su Qin was just a spirit dividing stage earth immortal. One had to know that Su Qin had shown his power on Kunlun Mountain. He had killed 5 earth immortals with a raise of his hand, and he had broken through the void with a flip of his palm. In the end, he had easily broken through the 1000th level of the illusion realm. Taiyin Fairy would believe that he was a divine ruins realm earth immortal. But in the end, Su Qin was only at the spirit dividing stage? How was this possible? Taiyin Fairy herself was also at the spirit dividing stage, and she was almost at the peak of the spirit dividing stage. With the inheritance secret method of the Taiyin Holy Land, she was enough to sweep through the spirit dividing stage. However, Taiyin Fairy, a spirit dividing stage earth immortal, was only a matter of a slap in front of Su Qin. How could Su Qin be a spirit dividing stage earth immortal? How could he be a spirit dividing stage earth immortal? Taiyin Fairy didn't dare to believe it, but she had to believe it. After all, the Essence Chi Ocean wouldn't lie. Since the Essence Chi Ocean didn't exceed 500 miles, it meant that Su Qin didn't break through to the divine ruins realm from the origin returning stage. As for deceiving the Essence Chi Ocean, even a supreme expert who could break through the void couldn't hide from the Essence Chi Ocean. Just as Taiyin Fairy was in disbelief, the Essence Chi Ocean that had originally appeared above Chang and City began to gradually disappear and hide in the depths of the void. The disappearance of the Essence Chi Ocean represented the end of Su Qin's breakthrough. Under Chang and City, Su Qin slowly opened his eyes. At this moment, the violent aura on his body gradually calmed down, but the pressure that naturally flowed out was even higher. I finally stepped into the true realm. A smile appeared on Su Qin's face. Calculating the time, it had been almost 10 years since he stepped into the spirit dividing stage Earth Immortal. In 10 years he had broken through a major realm. Although the speed was far from when he was in the myth realm, Su Qin was already quite satisfied. Now the power of my primordial spirit, the power of my physical body, chi and blood, and the power of my domain all belong to a certain point. No wonder this realm is called the true realm. Su Qin seemed to have understood something. At this moment, my strength is at least 10 times stronger than before the breakthrough. Su Qin clenched his fists and nodded slightly. Of course, this was only his speculation. The specific changes in strength would only be known after he attacked with all his strength. In addition, my war god domain has also skyrocketed. Su Qin felt it carefully and thought silently in his heart. The large success domain of an earth immortal could grow stronger as their strength increased. The Aries domain was originally built on the large success domain, and was transformed from the cultivation of the Aries catalog. However, the potential and power of the Aries domain far exceeded that of the large success domain. Just as Su Qin was about to stabilize his realm and come out of seclusion, suddenly, Su Qin felt a sense of peeping in the bottom of his heart. It was as if a certain existence had lowered its gaze and looked at Su Qin from afar. No, to be precise, this gaze was not looking at Su Qin but at the entire human world. It was just that Su Qin was in the human world, so he naturally received this gaze. And the reason why Su Qin had this feeling was not because of his strength, but because the Buddha golden body in the ancestral aperture between his eyebrows began to slowly vibrate. Who is it? Su Qin suddenly stood up and tried his best to activate the Eye of Truth and the Heavenly Man observation technique to look at the source of the peeping. In a trance, Su Qin saw an ancient and huge stone door. And inside the stone door, there was a huge eye that was as dark as an abyss and was slowly looking at him. Chapter 347. It's the Immortal Sect. The moment he looked at the huge ancient stone gate, Su Qin quickly deduced the whole story. The 4 Earth Immortals from the Immortal Sect had died in the hands of Su Qin. The 6 great sacred lands in the Immortal Sect probably knew about it long ago. Even many of the exalted sects overseas had left their disciples' life fires. Through the life fires they could immediately know whether their disciples were alive or dead, let alone the 6 great sacred lands in the Immortal Sect. And now, this gaze that was faintly peeking at the world must be the means used by the 6 great sacred lands in the Immortal Sect to find out the reason. The 6 great sacred lands in the immortal sect were eager to know why their earth immortals suddenly died in the human world. That gigantic eye. Su Qin's expression was solemn. Through the eye of truth and the heavenly man aura gaze, he could barely see the source of the gaze. It was a huge eye with an unfathomable black pupil. It's at least a treasure at the level of a natal cardinal treasure, Su Qin judged in his heart. He had never seen the natal cardinal treasure of a supreme expert, but now, just by relying on the gaze of that huge eye, Su Qin felt that it had already surpassed Raytheon's treasure, the Thunder God Cauldron. If I'm scanned by this gaze, I'm afraid I'll immediately be exposed to the immortal sect. Su Qin suddenly felt that it was troublesome. Su Qin didn't sense any threat from this gaze, so he speculated that the huge eye wasn't an offensive treasure, but some kind of detection treasure. But even so, Su Qin didn't want to be stared at by this gaze. After all, before he had the peerless strength to fight the entire immortal sect, Su Qin still planned to keep a low profile as much as possible. Just as Su Qin was thinking quickly, the gaze from the huge eye in the celestial gate instantly swept across the entire overseas martial arts world, and at a terrifying speed, it looked towards the battlefield. I have to find a way to avoid this gaze. Su Qin's thoughts fluctuated. After signing in for decades, he had obtained countless secret techniques to conceal his aura. But under this gaze that seemed to be able to see through the entire human world, Su Qin had no confidence in these secret techniques. Right. I still have the War God domain. In the blink of an eye, one thought after another flashed through Su Qin's mind. In the end, he locked onto the War God domain. The War God domain was a domain that Su Qin cultivated from the War God catalog that he obtained from signing in at the War God Temple. This was a mysterious inheritance that even the supreme powerhouse, Ho Yuan, couldn't obtain. When cultivated to the end, one would be able to evolve a complete world within the domain. Of course, Su Qin's cultivation of the God of War domain was far from reaching the level of evolving a world. Even so, the God of War domain was far superior to the domain of an ordinary Earth immortal. There were 2 main reasons why the Ares domain was stronger than a phenomenal success domain. The first was the suppression of heaven and earth. In this aspect, the War God domain was 10 times stronger than a phenomenal success domain. Just based on this alone, Su Qin could easily suppress at least 40% of a true realm Earth immortal of the same level. The second was that the War God domain was ultimately based on the evolution of a world. As a result, the War God domain itself had a trace of the world's spatial attributes. Under the cover of the War God domain, Su Qin seemed to be in another space. Whether it was the power of the primordial spirit or the domain covering methods, they couldn't detect Su Qin at all. This was because under the cover of his War God domain, Su Qin was already considered to be independent of the human world to a certain extent. Just these 2 points alone were enough to make the War God catalog worthy of the great price that the supreme powerhouse, Ho Yuan, had paid to specially create the War God Temple to pass it down. I can only try to avoid that gaze with the War God domain. Su Qin's mind moved, and layers of hazy domain suddenly spread out, covering a 10-meter radius around Su Qin. At this moment, although Su Qin still seemed to be in the black towering hall, in fact, if one looked carefully, they would find that Su Qin's figure was a little blurry and illusory, as if it was just an illusion. Next, Su Qin's mind moved. Suddenly, one of Su Qin's primordial spirit avatars on the Thunder God Island quickly dissipated. The War God domain wasn't a magical power, so it couldn't be mastered by the original body and the avatars at the same time. After doing this, Su Qin didn't do anything else and quietly waited for the gaze to descend. Buzz buzz buzz. Just a moment later, this gaze had already covered Chang'an City. Almost in an instant, countless living beings in Chang'an City, including Taiyin Fairy, were under the gaze of that gaze. However, even Taiyin Fairy didn't notice it at all and allowed the gaze to sweep across her body. In fact, Su Qin didn't find it strange at all. If not for the reminder from the golden Buddha statue in the ancestral aperture at mid-brows, Su Qin might not have noticed the gaze that was looking out from the immortal gate. Soon, that gaze came to the black towering hall under Chang'an City. Buzz! A slight fluctuation flashed by, and when it swept past Su Qin's blurry and illusory figure, it didn't stop at all and directly swept further away. I dodged it. Su Qin's face was filled with joy. If that gaze had discovered him, Su Qin would have inevitably felt that he was being spied on. But just now, there was no abnormality at all, and the Buddha's golden body in his forehead gradually calmed down and no longer vibrated. This war god domain is really incredible. Su Qin sighed slightly. Originally, he was just giving it a try with the war god domain. Even if it failed, Su Qin could bear it. At most, he would hide in the cave world. I can't rush. Su Qin didn't immediately retract the war god domain, but maintained this state. Sure enough, a moment later, that gaze swept over again until it scanned the human world several times before quickly returning to the immortal gate. This gaze that spies on the world isn't without a price? Su Qin speculated in his heart. If the 6 holy lands in the immortal gate could maintain this gaze without any restrictions, they would continue to observe the entire human world. How could they retract it? Since they had retracted it, it meant that the 6 holy lands had paid a price, and the price wasn't small. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so anxious. In the end, I still know too little about the holy lands in the immortal gate. Su Qin shook his head slightly. Although Taiyin Fairy was the prospective saintess of the Taiyin Holy Land, she was not a real saintess after all. Her understanding of the secrets of the Holy Land was limited. However, after spying on the human world this time, the Holy Lands in the Immortal Gate should be reassured. I think they will send more people out in the future. Su Qin's heart skipped a beat. According to Taiyin Fairy's description, now that the vitality tide in the human world had begun to recover, and the great path in the Immortal Gate had begun to dissipate, the 6 Holy Lands would definitely want to return to the human world as soon as possible. Thinking of this, Su Qin slowly raised his head and looked in the direction of the huge ancient stone gate that he had sensed with the eye of truth. It's impolite not to reciprocate. A smile appeared on Su Qin's face as he took a step forward and disappeared from the black majestic hall. Immortal Gate. The huge, pitch-black eye slowly dissipated. The Holy Lords were full of doubts as they recalled the scenes they had seen through the eye of the demon god. It's extremely normal in the human world. The most powerful person is only a pinnacle legend. The only earth immortal is Taiyin Fairy. How did we die? The Grand Beginning Holy Lord said with a frown. If they had discovered through the eye of the demon god that there were true realm earth immortals in the human world, it could explain the death of the Holy Land's disciples. However, the truth was that there was not even a single spirit severing realm earth immortal in the human world, let alone true realm earth immortals. Under such circumstances, how did the 4 earth immortal disciples sent by the Holy Lands die? Could it be those few supreme treasures? The Valley Master of the Spirit-Severing Valley guessed. The eye of the demon god had indeed discovered the aura of a few supreme treasures in the overseas martial arts world. Impossible. Those supreme treasures are just ordinary supreme treasures. They're not natal supreme treasures. Without an earth immortal powerhouse activating it, it's impossible to kill other earth immortals. The sect master of the Heavenly Saber Mountain immediately shook his head. Even supreme treasures needed to be activated by powerhouses to unleash their power. Then what's the reason? The Holy Lords looked at each other in confusion. Could it be that the person who did it dodged the eye of the demon god? The Valley Master of the Wind God Valley pondered for a while and said, "Dodged the eye of the demon god?" The Grandine Holy Lord immediately retorted. The eye of the demon god was refined by the combined efforts of several supreme powerhouses. It can see through all the secrets in the world. Unless it's a supreme powerhouse who's immune to karma, who can dodge it? The Grandine Holy Lord paused for a while before continuing. If the person who did it is really a supreme powerhouse, why hide? Can't he just kill his way into the immortal sect? The Grandine Holy Lord had just finished speaking. The other Holy Lords nodded slightly. Indeed. What kind of existence was the eye of the demon god? To dodge the eye of the demon god, one had to have the strength of a supreme powerhouse. Even if the 6 great holy lands of the immortal sect worked together, they would not be able to stop such a powerhouse. Although the 6 great holy lands had countless foundations and natal supreme treasures to suppress them, their natal supreme treasures were only close to a supreme powerhouse. There was a huge difference between a supreme powerhouse and a true supreme powerhouse. Logically speaking, the Holy Lord's thoughts were not wrong. In order to dodge the eye of the demon god, one needed to be in supreme powerhouse to control space. Even the direct descendants of the supreme powerhouses who inherited part of the supreme powerhouse's control of space would not be able to dodge the eye of the demon god. But all the holy lords had overlooked the war god catalog. The war god domain formed by the war god catalog already had the attributes of the world to a certain extent. It was equivalent to the embryonic form of the supreme powerhouses immune to karma. It was normal for it to be able to dodge the eye of the demon god. The war god catalog was an inheritance that even the supreme powerhouse, Ho Yuan, could not obtain. No matter how hard the 6 great holy lands racked their brains, they would not have thought that there would be such a method to dodge the eye of the demon god. Chapter 348. In the palace, the sacred lords fell into deep thought. At this moment, the Purple Mansion sacred lord, who had been silent all this while, said, "Perhaps our disciples were not killed by others?" The Purple Mansion sacred lord came from the Purple Mansion sacred ground, which was the only one among the 6 sacred grounds that specialized in essence soul killer moves. Not killed by others? The Grandine sacred lord looked at the Purple Mansion sacred lord and asked, "What do you mean?" The other sacred lords also looked at the Purple Mansion sacred lord. To enter the human world from the immortal world, one has to pass through the void tunnel. The void tunnel is filled with spatial turbulence and spatial fragments. The Purple Mansion sacred lord glanced at everyone and continued, "Even with the Grandine token's protection, there is no guarantee that one can pass through the void tunnel." "That is indeed possible." The Grand Beginning sacred lord nodded. The Grandine token contained the spatial power left behind by an ultimate expert. Logically speaking, it should be able to block the spatial turbulence and spatial fragments. But theory was theory and reality was reality. The power of space was a high-level power that only the strongest could master. Even if the several land immortals at the divinity separation stage had the protection of the Taiyin token, they might not be able to block the space fragments and space turbulence. Alright. Since you have confirmed that there is no threat in the human world, what should we do next? The Heavenly Sword Mountain Master agreed with the Purple Mansion sacred lord. After all, they could not think of any other reason other than the Purple Mansion sacred lord. If there was no threat to the land immortals in the human world, what else could it be other than an accident during the void tunnel? Since we have confirmed that there is no threat in the human world, why don't we send a few elders with a treasure to the human world? The Valley Master of the Wind God Valley looked at the others and said, "In the immortal world, only true realm land immortals had the chance to become elders of the sacred grounds. The elders of the sacred grounds were considered to be at the top of the sacred grounds. Other than the sacred lords and the grand elders, the elders had the highest status. In the entire immortal world, there were less than 100 elders of the 6 sacred grounds. Every one of them was extremely important. Before they knew what the situation in the human world was like, the 6 sacred grounds were only willing to send spirits severing land immortals. That way, even if an accident happened, they would be able to handle it. As for the true realm elders, losing one was enough to make a holy land feel the pinch for a while. Therefore, without full confidence, no sacred ground would be willing to lose a true realm elder. However, now that they had confirmed through the eye of the demon god that there was no threat in the human world, the sacred lords naturally did not have such worries. If it weren't for the fact that the sacred lords needed to guard the sacred grounds and control their natal treasures, there would have been sacred lords who would have gone to the human world themselves. That's right. Although the Taiyin token was left behind by an absolute expert, it can't be compared to a true treasure. If we have the protection of a true treasure, we should be able to pass through the void tunnel safely, the Taiyin Holy Master said with a nod. It's a pity that only after the vitality tide in the human world has passed through at least 6 tipping points will a certain balance be formed between the world of immortals and the human world. At that time, the immortal gate will be completely opened. Before that, if you want to go to the human world, you can only go one by one. The Grand Beginning Sacred Land shook its head. In order to prevent the world within the immortal gate from being affected by the stillness of the human world's vitality chi, the absolute experts 10,000 years ago had put in a lot of effort. Only at a specific time could they completely open the tunnel to the human world. As for now, the sacred lords were using the backup plan left behind by the absolute experts to forcefully send people to the human world through the gap in the seal. At most 3 to 5 people would be sent each time. After the sacred lords discussed and decided, they immediately returned to their respective sacred grounds and chose the elders who would go to the human world. In the end, 3 people were chosen. They were the Wind God Valley's Wind King, the Purple Mansion Sacred Grounds Taoist Wan Yuan, and the Heavenly Sword Mountain's 9 Senses Saber Master. These 3 True Realm land immortals had all entered the True Realm for 1 or 200 years. Although they were not as strong as those peak True Realm land immortals, they were not weak. As for the treasure to pass through the Void Tunnel, it was provided by the primeval sacred land. It was a pagoda-shaped treasure. This pagoda-shaped treasure was a defensive treasure. As long as the 3 True Realm land immortals were under this pagoda-shaped treasure, they would be safe and sound no matter how many spatial fragments there were. When you arrive at the human world, immediately occupy the battlefield and wait for the 6th critical point of the Vitality Tide recovery, the Taiyin Sacred Lord said lightly. The reason why the Taiyin Sacred Land did not send anyone this time was because Taiyin Fairy was still alive. Through the eye of the demon god, Taiyin Fairy should already be in the battlefield. Yes, Sacred Lord. The Wind King and the other 2 True Realm land immortals bowed slightly. In that case, you may go. The primeval sacred land waved its hand. Suddenly, a pagoda-shaped treasure rose and stopped on the Wind King and the other 2. Then it brought the 3 land immortals into the entrance to the human world. The inside of the void passage was gray and hazy. There was no direction to go up or down, but in the distance one could vaguely see a huge ancient stone gate standing tall. That's the human world? Taoist Wan Yuan of the Purple Mansion Sacred Ground looked in the direction of the stone gate, with a trace of anticipation on his face. He was born in the immortal gate since he was young. He only knew about the existence of the human world from the ancient books in the sacred ground. In Taoist Wan Yuan's knowledge, only the human world could give birth to a truly invincible absolute expert. The sacred lords are too cautious. They actually activated the eye of the demon god. After confirming that there are no threats in the human world, they decided to let us go. The Wind King of the Valley of the Wind shook his head. Activating the eye of the demon god not only requires endless vitality and spiritual vigor, but also the power of space. Such a great price is actually used in the human world where vitality has been dormant for thousands of years. The Wind King of the Valley of the Wind sighed softly. Enough. The sacred lords are also doing this for our safety. Besides, the reason why the sacred lords are doing this is because the martial nephews who entered the human world have all died. The 9 Senses Saber Master of the Sky Saber Mountain said, what I mean is that the sacred lords don't have to do that at all. Isn't it better to just let us go and sweep the entire human world? The Wind King of the Valley of the Wind was very confident. As a true realm land immortal and a wind-type land immortal who was good at speed, even if the Wind King encountered a peak true realm existence, he could still escape even if he could not defeat them. Therefore, he did not put the human world in his eyes. Even in the world of the immortal sects that maintained the prosperity of martial arts, there were only a few who could enter the Wind King's eyes, let alone the human world where vitality had been dormant for thousands of years. Just as the 3 of them were talking, dong! A loud sound suddenly came from the huge ancient stone door, and then a crack appeared. The Wind King and the other 2 quickly followed the crack, passed through the void passage, and came to the human world. Is this the human world? Taoist Wan Yuan of the Purple Mansion Sacred Ground took a deep breath and muttered to himself, although vitality and spiritual vigor are thin, the laws of the Great Path are clearly much clearer. Stop talking nonsense, let's go directly to the battlefield. The Wind King of the Valley of the Wind looked at the battlefield, and a hint of heat appeared on his face. I heard that there are countless living beings in the human world, and the number of living beings in any random dynasty is in the hundreds of millions. It's interesting to enslave these ants. Although there were also a large number of living beings in the immortal sects, they were all kept in captivity by the various sacred grounds. Even with the Wind King's status, he could not act recklessly. However, it was different in the human world. In the human world, with the Wind King's strength, he was invincible. How many living beings could he enslave with just a thought? Just as the Wind King was in high spirits and wanted to head to the battlefield as quickly as possible, the face of the 9 Senses Saber Master of the Heavenly Saber Mountain changed slightly. Something's wrong. Just as the 9 Senses Saber Master finished speaking, Layers of distorted domains quickly spread out, and then enveloped the Wind King and the other two. With the domains on their bodies, the Wind King and the others felt that there were heavy shackles on their bodies, and their strength was suppressed by more than 40%. Who is it? The Purple Mansion Sacred Grounds Taoist Wan Yuan's pupils suddenly shrank, and he looked in a certain direction. The Wind King and the Nine Senses Saber Master's faces were solemn, and they also followed the Taoist's gaze. A few miles away from the source of the layers of domains, a tall and slender man slowly walked out. The man's eyes were calm and his aura was deep. With his hands behind his back, he was sizing up the Wind King and the other two. I've been waiting for you guys for a long time. Chapter 349. Outside the huge ancient stone gate, the Wind King and the other two from the God of Wind Valley stared at Su Qin, who was walking over slowly. They were shocked. The sacred masters had long told them that there were no living beings at the spirit-severing stage, or earth immortal level in the human world. This was the conclusion they came to after using the eye of the demon god to spy on the world. However, the aura that Su Qin inadvertently revealed was more than that of a spirit-severing stage earth immortal. He was at least a true realm earth immortal of the same level as them. In addition, the Wind King and the other two could clearly feel that the surroundings were faintly covered by a kind of domain. Under this domain, their dermic powers and chi blood were obscure, and their strength was at least 40% suppressed. How incredible was this? The Wind King and the other two were all true realm earth immortals. When the three of them joined forces, they would not be afraid even if they encountered an existence at the peak of the true realm. Even a powerhouse in the Divine Ruins realm would not have the means to suppress their strength by 40% before they even got close. Is this the power of a domain? No, this domain is more than 10 times stronger than our domain of the true realm. Taoist Wan Yuan from the Purple Mansion Sacred Ground muttered to himself in disbelief. Whether it was a spirit-severing stage earth immortal, a true realm earth immortal, or a Divine Ruins realm earth immortal, there were differences in the mastery of the domains of these three levels, but there was no fundamental change. It was impossible for there to be a difference of more than 10 times. Taoist Wan Yuan did not know that Su Qin's domain was no longer the mastery of the domain of ordinary earth immortals, but the God of War domain that even the strongest could not obtain. With the ability of the God of War domain to evolve the world, how could a mere mastery of the domain compare to it? The Nine Senses Saber Master of the Heavenly Saber Mountain looked at Su Qin and said solemnly, "Sir, have you been waiting for us here?" Not long after they left the Immortal Gate, they met Su Qin. Moreover, Su Qin used a method that they did not know to suppress their strength by 40%. It was obvious that the other party had come prepared. That's right. Su Qin did not hide anything and nodded frankly. After avoiding the eye of the demon god, Su Qin knew that many of the holy lands in the Immortal Gate would definitely make other moves. Therefore, he had arrived early to wait outside the Immortal Gate. If the Sacred Ground sent out a land immortal of the Divine Ruin realm, Su Qin would turn around and leave without a word. With the War God domain's ability to conceal his aura, as long as Su Qin didn't openly walk past the land immortal of the Divine Ruin realm, he wouldn't be discovered. And if the Holy Land only sent out earth immortals below the Divine Ruins realm, Su Qin would reluctantly suppress them. I'll give you two choices. Surrender or die. Su Qin didn't want to waste time talking nonsense and said directly. As soon as he said this, the expressions of the Wind King and the other two immediately became unsightly. No matter what, the three of them were true realm land immortals. If they joined forces, even if they faced a Divine Ruins powerhouse, they still had hope of escaping. However, Su Qin directly asked them to surrender. The Wind King of the Divine Wind Valley had a cold expression on his face as he looked at Su Qin and said, "It seems that you're the one who killed the disciples of our holy land. As a true realm land immortal, how powerful was the power of his primordial spirit?" Almost instantly, he understood the whole story. How did you avoid the eye of the demon god? Taoist Wan Yuan of the Purple Mansion Sacred Ground frowned slightly. He couldn't understand why the eye of the demon god didn't detect Su Qin. You guys talk too much nonsense. Su Qin took a step forward and stepped into the depths of the void with his right hand. He pulled out the demon god's blade and gently slashed at the three of them. In an instant, heaven and earth turned pitch black. A blade light that looked like a gap in space flashed and disappeared. Wherever it passed, even the air began to distort as if it couldn't withstand the blade chi within it. You underestimate us too much, the Nine Senses saber owner of the heavenly saber mountain said softly. Although Su Qin's strength was powerful, they weren't weak either. Moreover, they were all true realm land immortals. Su Qin dared to make the first move when he was fighting against three of them alone. He was simply arrogant to the extreme. Buzz! An extremely dazzling blade light appeared in the Nine Senses saber owner's hand, and then slashed at Su Qin. My heavenly saber mountain specializes in saber Dao. You want to compete with me in saber Dao? Before the Nine Senses saber owner could smile, he saw an unbelievable scene. The pitch-black blade light easily broke through everything. The dazzling blade light that the Nine Senses saber owner had slashed out started to crumble like a thin piece of paper. Then the pitch-black blade light didn't slow down and silently slashed at the Nine Senses saber owner and the others. How is this possible? The Nine Senses saber owner's body shook violently. The heavenly saber mountain was a sacred orthodoxy established by an ultimate expert of the saber technique lineage. However, the heavenly saber mountain's inherited killer move was quickly shattered in front of Su Qin. How was this possible? Could it be that Su Qin's earlier slash also came from an ultimate expert of the saber technique lineage? Just as the Nine Senses saber owner was dumbfounded, the pitch-black blade light had already approached the three of them. The Nine Senses saber owner didn't have time to think and quickly slashed out dozens of times. Then, he joined forces with the Wind King and Taoist Wan Yuan to block the pitch-black blade light. This is too terrifying. The Nine Senses saber owner's heart palpitated. Although they were shrouded in the God of War domain and their strength was suppressed by 40%, the three of them could only block one slash from Su Qin. This wasn't just because their strength was suppressed. Even without the God of War domain, the three of them wouldn't be Su Qin's match even if they were at their peak strength. Could it be that this person is already at the peak of the true realm? Saber Master Jujua felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. Only those who were at the peak of the true realm, and not just any ordinary peak of the true realm, but the kind of earth immortal who could enter the divine ruin realm at any time, could suppress the three of them. Impossible. Why is my primordial spirit killer move useless against you? Compared to the Nine Senses saber owner's shock, the Taoist Wan Yuan beside him was tongue-tied. When Su Qin and the Nine Senses saber owner were fighting, Taoist Wan Yuan had released more than 10 primordial spirit killer moves consecutively. These killer moves consumed 60% of Taoist Wan Yuan's primordial spirit power, and they all landed on Su Qin. However, what Taoist Wan Yuan couldn't believe was that all his primordial spirit killer moves were like raindrops falling into the ocean when they landed on Su Qin's body. They didn't even cause a ripple. How was this possible? Even if Su Qin's primordial spirit was extremely powerful and far surpassed Taoist Wan Yuan's, it was impossible for him to ignore more than 10 primordial spirit killer moves. He should have at least paused for a moment to deal with them. But what about Su Qin? He didn't even blink. If Taoist Wan Yuan hadn't clearly sensed that his primordial spirit power was greatly consumed, he might have thought that he hadn't used any primordial spirit killer moves. Oh no! Retreat to the immortal sect immediately. Wind God Valley's Wind King saw this and realized the difference in strength. He retreated to the huge ancient stone door without hesitation. Taoist Wan Yuan and the Nine Senses saber owner did the same. They had spent 700 to 800 years to become true realm land immortals. They naturally cherished their lives. After knowing that Su Qin was no match for them, they didn't hesitate to retreat to the immortal sect. The immortal sect had a void tunnel filled with spatial fragments, and the divine lords were there to receive them. As long as they retreated to the immortal sect, they would be safe. Want to leave? Su Qin shook his head with disdain. Since he dared to attack outside the immortal sect, he wasn't afraid that the trio would escape. Battle God Domain. Su Qin willed. In an instant, the Battle God Domain, which had originally encompassed a radius of several tens of li, started to shrink incessantly, forming a small-scale domain that spanned several li. Within this domain, the speed of the Wind King and the other two suddenly plummeted. This is. The Wind King and the other two immediately stopped. They exchanged glances and no longer fled. What kind of technique is this? Wind King growled impatiently. If it wasn't for the suppression of the War God domain, even if the three of them couldn't defeat Su Qin, they would have no problem retreating. However, because of the War God domain, the Wind King and the others couldn't even return to the Immortal Sect. And at this moment, Su Qin took a step forward. This time Su Qin didn't use the Demon God's blade. Instead, he clenched his right hand into a fist and channeled all his qi and blood. He gently punched towards the trio. Rumble! Su Qin's body was extremely powerful. After breaking through to the true realm, Su Qin's primordial spirit once again guided the energy of the essence Qi ocean to replenish it. The Great Sun diagram lit up from 500 light spots to 2,000 light spots. This caused the Golden Crow divine body to reach a higher level. His qi and blood were as vast as the ocean. The moment the punch was thrown, the Wind King and the other two True Realm Earth Immortals felt their scalps explode, and a sense of life and death surged into their hearts. Hurry up and use the supreme treasure bestowed by the sacred leader. Saber Master Juju's expression changed drastically. Under the suppression of the Battle God domain, they couldn't dodge this punch at all. There was only one choice if they wanted to survive. Fight head-on. Supreme treasure. Wind King took a deep breath and poured his dermic powers into a pagoda-shaped supreme treasure. Suddenly, buzz! The pagoda-shaped supreme treasure floated up and stopped above the trio. Then it lowered layers of light screens to protect the trio. This pagoda-shaped supreme treasure was bestowed by the primordial sacred leader of the Immortal Sect. It was a defensive supreme treasure that allowed the trio to pass through the void passage. Originally, Wind King wasn't willing to use this supreme treasure. After all, the primordial sacred leader only allowed them to pass through the void passage. He didn't say that they could use this supreme treasure. If Wind King used this supreme treasure without permission, it would definitely cause the primordial sacred leader's displeasure when they returned to the Immortal Sect. However, at this moment they were about to lose their lives. Why would Wind King care about the primordial sacred leader's displeasure? The next moment, Su Qin punched the layers of light screens of the pagoda-shaped supreme treasure. Dong! There were ripples on the light screen, but it quickly returned to normal. Wind King and the other two heaved a sigh of relief when they saw this. Supreme treasure? Su Qin retracted his right fist. He had seen supreme treasures before. When he destroyed Raytheon, Su Qin had used his physical body to block Raytheon's supreme treasure, the Thunder God Bell. However, when Su Qin blocked the Thunder God Bell, it was because Raytheon's ancestral patriarch hadn't unleashed the true power of the supreme treasure. But now, with the three True Realm Earth Immortals pouring in their dermic powers, the true power of the pagoda-shaped supreme treasure was revealed. Ha 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 ha. With the protection of the supreme treasure, you can dream on if you want to kill us. Wind King laughed. Saber Master Juju and Taoist Wan Yuan also smiled and looked at Su Qin. However, just as the three True Realm Earth Immortals looked at Su Qin, they suddenly realized that Su Qin's eyes were deep as if there was a vast world within them. It was the primordial spirit killer move that Su Qin had obtained from signing in on the 3000 Illusion Island, Abyss of Darkness. In a trance, the minds of Wind King and the other two began to gradually dissipate, as if they were being drawn into that vast world. Chapter 350. Su Qin saw Wind King and the other two activating their supreme treasures to protect themselves, and used the primordial spirit killer move, Abyss of Darkness, without hesitation. The supreme treasures were very powerful, especially this pagoda-shaped supreme treasure. It was a defensive supreme treasure. Under the full power of the Wind King and the other two True Realm Earth deities, it would be able to withstand the attack of a pinnacle divine ruins magnate for a while. Although Su Qin had many trump cards and methods, he did not think he could match a peak divine ruin realm land immortal. Thus, he did not think of facing this defensive supreme treasure head-on. Buzz! Wind King and the other two felt like they had fallen into endless darkness. To them, Su Qin's eyes seemed to have a fatal attraction. They could not help but sink into them. Evidently, Su Qin's primordial spirit killer move had already started to affect the three. This was not because Su Qin's strength had surpassed peak divine ruin realm, but because primordial spirit killer moves were formless and unpredictable. Unless it was a primordial spirit supreme treasure refined by an expert of the primordial spirit lineage, other supreme treasures could not completely block the penetration of primordial spirit killer moves. This is. Among the three Purple Mansion Sacred Lands, Taoist Wan Yuan was the first to break free from the influence of the primordial spirit killer move, Abyss of Darkness. After all, Taoist Wan Yuan was a origin-returning realm land immortal of the primordial spirit lineage. His resistance to primordial spirit killer moves was stronger than the other two. Adding on the protection of the supreme treasure, even if the primordial spirit killer move, Abyss of Darkness, penetrated, its power would be reduced to less than half. What happened? Immediately after, the other two also quickly reacted and looked around with a blank expression. Oh no! Taoist Wan Yuan's expression changed as he shouted, "Activate the supreme treasure again." Earlier, when the three were affected by the primordial spirit killer move, they lost control of their magic power and did not continue to inject it into the supreme treasure. Without the support of their magic power, the pagoda-shaped defensive supreme treasure above their heads started to weaken rapidly. Wind King and Nine Senses Sabermaster's expressions changed as well. If they lost the protection of the supreme treasure, they had no confidence in returning to the sect alive from Su Qin's hands. However, just as the Wind King and the other two were about to continue pouring their magic power into the treasure, a deep and powerful voice suddenly rang out in their ears. It's too late. Under the shocked gazes of the Wind King and the other two, Su Qin's figure had already appeared before them. To be more precise, he had appeared before the pagoda-shaped defensive treasure. Before the three of them could react, Su Qin stretched out his right hand and clenched it into a fist. Then, he slammed it into the pagoda-shaped true treasure. Dong! This pagoda-shaped true treasure was a defensive true treasure. Compared to the Thunder God Clock, which was a sound wave true treasure, it was much stronger in terms of defense. However, Su Qin's strength was far from when he had destroyed Raytheon. After entering the Origin Realm, Su Qin had used the power of the primordial Qi to light up 2,000 light spots in the Great Sun diagram. His Golden Crow divine body had also reached a new level. Every move he made felt like the world was collapsing. If this pagoda-shaped defensive supreme treasure was still activated by the three Origin Realm land immortals, Su Qin would not be able to do anything to them. However, at this moment, under the influence of the primordial spirit killer move, Abyss of Darkness, the Wind King and the other two had already let go of their control over the pagoda-shaped true treasure. And without the owner's control, unless it was a life treasure that had already faintly gained sentience, otherwise ordinary supreme treasures were just a tortoise shell in Su Qin's eyes. Even if he could not break it, he could kick it far away. Dong! A dull sound could be heard. The pagoda-shaped true treasure floating above the Wind King, and the other two was sent flying by Su Qin's punch even though it was not damaged at all. And under the control of Su Qin's War God domain, this pagoda-shaped true treasure was directly stored in the War God Temple. The Wind King and the other two were dumbfounded. In just a few moments, their most powerful trump card, that pagoda-shaped defensive supreme treasure, had disappeared? Especially the Wind King. That pagoda-shaped true treasure was given to him by the Grand Beginning Divine Lord to pass through the Void Tunnel. Hence, the Wind King had a certain sense of that supreme treasure. But at this moment, the Wind King felt that the pagoda-shaped true treasure was extremely far away from him, as if they were in another world. The War God Temple's expert, Ho Yuan, had specially refined a super-large spatial Dharma treasure to inherit the War God catalog. It was independent of the mortal world. The pagoda-shaped true treasure was stored in the War God Temple. To a certain extent, it was indeed a world away from the Wind King. Fellow Taoist, please spare my life. The Wind King begged without hesitation. Although the Immortal Gate was not far away, it was not even a few miles away. But under the cover of the War God domain, the Wind King knew that this distance was equivalent to a natural moat. Su Qin shook his head slightly and said, "You're trying to stall for time, right? You left an Essence Soul avatar in the Immortal Gate. You're probably trying to stall for time and report to your Divine Lord so that he can come out and save you?" Su Qin opened his eye of truth, and all kinds of auras appeared in his vision. Naturally, the Wind King's aura was among them, and Su Qin noticed that the Wind King had a total of 2 auras. One of them was right in front of him, and the other was hidden deep inside the Immortal Gate. The Immortal Gate did not belong to the mortal world. Even the Eye of Truth could not see through the Void Tunnel and observe the Immortal Gate. But with the Wind King's aura in front of him as a coordinate, Su Qin could naturally discover the other aura belonging to the Wind King in the direction of the Immortal Gate. How did you know? The Wind King was shocked. Fellow Taoist, before the Wind King could continue speaking, he saw a pair of deep eyes that seemed to contain a vast world. At this moment, without the protection of the pagoda-shaped treasure, the Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, completely landed on the Wind King's body. In an instant, the Wind King's mind fell into darkness again, and his body floated there motionlessly. Swoosh! Su Qin directly slammed his palm and smashed the Wind King's body into meat paste. Next, the pine tree crushed his Essence Soul. This Essence Soul Killer move is really useful. Su Qin was quite satisfied. In fact, although the Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, was terrifying, it could only be used against martial artists whose cultivation level was far lower than Su Qin's. For example, when Su Qin faced a group of Earth Immortals who had just entered the spirit-severing stage, the Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, directly collapsed the essence soul of this group of spirit-severing stage Earth Immortals. But against experts of the same cultivation level, such as the Wind King, who was a origin returning stage Earth Immortal, the Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, could only affect the other party, and cause their mind to fall into darkness for a moment. And after a moment, the other party would be able to break free from the influence of the Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness. But unfortunately for Su Qin, not to mention a moment, even an instant was enough for him to attack hundreds of times. The Essence Soul Clone is entrusted to the main body. If the main body dies, the Essence Soul Clone will naturally dissipate. Su Qin retracted his right hand and glanced at the Immortal Gate. Indeed, the two auras belonging to the Wind King, whether it was the one in front of him or the one inside the Immortal Gate, had both disappeared. The Essence Soul Clone was different from the divine sense that Su Qin had created through the Great Demonic Will Separation Parasitism. The Essence Soul Clone was a method that spirit-severing stage Earth Immortals naturally grasped. The Essence Soul Clone was completely entrusted to the main body, and if the main body died, the Essence Soul Clone would rapidly dissipate. But the Great Demonic Will Separation Parasitism could create a shared but independent divine sense. Although the two were the same life form, their life and death were not affected by each other. This was also the reason why Su Qin had always let the clone that he had created through the Great Demonic Will Separation Parasitism stay in the cave world. Whether it was the main body or the Demonic Will Separation Parasitism, as long as one of them didn't die, Su Qin would have two lives. This was the most terrifying part of the Great Demonic Will Separation Parasitism. The Wind King has fallen. Not far away, when the Nine Senses Saber Master saw this scene, his scalp went numb, and he immediately began to burn his blood essence Shoyuan. Even his primordial spirit began to burn. But the next moment, the Nine Senses Saber Master once again looked at a pair of eyes that were as deep as the vast world. No! The Nine Senses Saber Master clearly knew that all of this was Su Qin's killing move. But he couldn't break free no matter what. He could only watch as his mind sank into darkness, and then his physical body and primordial spirit were crushed by Su Qin's palm. It's really easy. After Su Qin destroyed the Nine Senses Saber Master's physical body and primordial spirit, he sighed again. If he didn't have the primordial spirit killer move Abyss of Darkness with his various trump cards, he could still kill the other party, but it would also be troublesome, and a trace of the other party's primordial spirit might have escaped. Whether it was the Wind King or the Nine Senses Saber Master, they were both true realm land immortals with peerless talent, and who knew how many fortuitous encounters they had encountered. Even when facing the suppression of a divine ruin realm overlord, they could still escape, let alone Su Qin. But the primordial spirit killer move, Abyss of Darkness, completely cut off this possibility. Under the influence of Abyss of Darkness, the other party's mind would fall into darkness, and they wouldn't even be able to move, let alone escape. Looks like I have to be careful of primordial spirit experts next time, Su Qin thought to himself. Although his primordial aperture had the Buddha golden body suppressing it, and ignoring all primordial spirit killer moves, there were some strange primordial spirit killer moves that didn't kill your primordial spirit. This was Su Qin's wishful thinking. Ordinary primordial spirit experts were proficient in primordial spirit killer moves, and their methods were strange and unpredictable, but their physical bodies were abnormally weak. Even if they used primordial spirit killer moves to restrain the enemy for a moment, they would not be able to destroy the other party's physical body. Unlike Su Qin, who had terrifying primordial spirit killer moves and an unparalleled physical body. With the combination of the two, the primordial spirit killer moves would restrain the other party and then directly destroy the other party's physical body. With the combination of the two, it was enough for Su Qin to sweep through most of his peers. Just as Su Qin was killing the Wind King and the Nine Senses Saber Master. Inside the Immortal Sect. Inside the Wind God Valley. The primordial spirit clone that the Wind King had left behind in the valley flew into the sky, ignoring the obstruction of countless formations as it headed towards a certain direction. What happened? The Wind God Valley Lord immediately noticed the Wind King's actions and quickly appeared before him, asking with a frown, "Valley Lord, save." A trace of fear appeared on the Wind King's face. He opened his mouth, but before he could finish his words, his body rapidly dissipated. When the Wind God Valley Lord saw this, his expression turned extremely ugly. There was only one possibility for the Wind King's primordial spirit clone to suddenly dissipate. The Wind King had died. Who is it? The Wind God Valley Lord's aura suddenly burst out, and the terrifying peak of the Divine Ruin Realm's aura shrouded the heavens and earth, almost beginning to pry open space and affect the world. Even though the Wind God Valley was a sacred ground left behind by an expert and had countless foundations and was one of the 6 sacred grounds of the immortal sects, a true realm land immortal was definitely a pillar of support for the Wind God Valley. There were only slightly more than 10 true realm land immortals in the entire Wind God Valley. Now that one of them had suddenly died, even the peak of the Divine Ruin Realm's Valley Lord felt extremely pained. Heavenly Saber Mountain. The Nine Senses Saber Master's primordial spirit clone also forcibly dissipated before the Mountain Lord. What happened in the human realm? The Heavenly Saber Mountain Lord's expression was solemn as he muttered to himself. Whether it was the Wind King or the Nine Senses Saber Master, they had all died too quickly. It had only been a few moments, and their primordial spirit clones had quickly dissipated before they could say anything useful. When the Divine Lords and the other Divine Lords joined forces and activated the Demon God's Eye to spy on the human realm, we didn't find any land immortals. The Heavenly Saber Mountain Lord's brows were tightly knitted. The supreme treasure bestowed by the primordial Divine Lord and its power passed through the void tunnel without any danger. The Heavenly Saber Mountain Lord was perplexed. In his opinion, the Wind King and the other two should have been safe in the human realm. How could they have died? This is troublesome. The Heavenly Saber Mountain Lord thought to himself. Primordial Divine Grounds. The Primordial Divine Lord did not know that the Wind King and the Nine Senses Saber Master had already died. The Supreme Treasure's aura has weakened by a lot? The Primordial Divine Lord rubbed his brows, his heart filled with shock and doubt. He was still the true owner of the pagoda-shaped Supreme Treasure that he had bestowed upon the Wind King and the others, so he could roughly sense the location of the pagoda-shaped Supreme Treasure. But just now, the Primordial Divine Lord suddenly sensed that the pagoda-shaped Supreme Treasure was almost beyond his senses. Even though the Primordial Divine Lord could vaguely sense that the pagoda-shaped Supreme Treasure was still there, he could not pinpoint its exact location. What happened? The Primordial Divine Lord vaguely felt that something was wrong, so he immediately contacted the Heavenly Saber Mountain Lord. As the 6 sacred grounds of the Immortal Sect, they naturally had a way to quickly contact each other. In front of the Immortal Sect, after Su Qin killed the Wind King and the Nine Senses Saber Master, he looked at Daoist Wan Yuan. Daoist Wan Yuan was a land immortal from the Purple Mansion Sacred Ground, and the Purple Mansion Sacred Ground's path was the primordial spirit. That's right. You're the only one who didn't leave behind your primordial spirit clone. Su Qin looked at Daoist Wan Yuan and said casually. Through the eye of truth, Su Qin naturally discovered that Daoist Wan Yuan's aura was only in front of him, and there was no other aura in the Immortal Sect. This meant that Daoist Wan Yuan did not leave behind his primordial spirit clone. Otherwise, the primordial spirit clone was equivalent to Daoist Wan Yuan, and their auras were completely identical. Under the eye of truth, it would not be able to hide from Su Qin. It was precisely because of this that Su Qin deliberately spared Daoist Wan Yuan's life. After all, Su Qin still wanted to obtain more detailed information about the Immortal Sect from him. I didn't leave behind my primordial spirit clone. Taoist Wan Yuan smiled bitterly. He vaguely realized that this was probably the reason why he was still alive. Indeed, Taoist Wan Yuan did not leave behind his primordial spirit clone. Splitting the primordial spirit and leaving behind a clone would weaken the primordial spirit power. And this would greatly affect a land immortal of the primordial spirit lineage. Moreover, if the main body died, the primordial spirit clone would also dissipate, so leaving behind a primordial spirit clone was the same result. Fellow Taoist, if you have any questions, please ask. I'll definitely tell you everything I know. Taoist Wan Yuan sighed softly and bowed to Su Qin. Chapter 351. You're pretty smart. Su Qin glanced at Taoist Wan Yuan with a smile on his face. He originally thought that Taoist Wan Yuan would struggle a few more times. As a land immortal of the Essence Soul lineage, if Taoist Wan Yuan was willing to give up his body and escape with his Essence Soul, there was a glimmer of hope for him to escape the suppression of the War God domain. But it was only a glimmer of hope. With the War God domain's control and suppression of heaven and earth, Taoist Wan Yuan's chances of escaping were less than 1 in 10,000. Besides, even if Taoist Wan Yuan was lucky enough to escape, what could he do? Without the protection of the pagoda-shaped treasure, Taoist Wan Yuan couldn't pass through the void passage in the immortal sect with his essence soul body. He could only hide in a corner of the human world. With the observation of the aura of the world with the eye of truth, Taoist Wan Yuan couldn't escape from Su Qin's five-finger mountain. Taoist Wan Yuan shook his head and said, "Fellow Taoist, your strength is unfathomable. How would I dare to fight against you?" Taoist Wan Yuan didn't know that Su Qin had a divine ability like the Eye of Truth that could lock onto one's aura. However, Su Qin had defeated 3 true realm land immortals with just a wave of his hand. Especially his last punch, which directly sent the pagoda-shaped treasure flying. How unbelievable was that? One had to know that this was a treasure and it was a defensive treasure. Even the spatial fragments that could shatter everything couldn't do anything to it. Although Su Qin had used his Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, to temporarily restrain their minds before he sent the pagoda-shaped treasure flying with a punch, they didn't have the energy to continue controlling the pagoda-shaped treasure. Even so, the pagoda-shaped treasure wasn't something that a true realm land immortal could shake. Okay, don't resist. With a thought, Su Qin turned a wisp of Essence Soul power into a seed and gently planted it into Taoist Wan Yuan's forehead. It was the great Tao Heart Demon seed art that Su Qin had obtained from signing in. This was an Essence Soul secret technique that was specially used to enslave others. Apart from enslavement, Su Qin could also clearly sense the other party's emotional fluctuations through this Essence Soul secret technique and determine if they were lying. Taoist Wan Yuan sensed that his ancestral aperture was being invaded. He hesitated for a moment but did not stop it. Instead, he opened his ancestral aperture and allowed the other party to invade. With Taoist Wan Yuan's attainments in his essence soul, there was naturally no problem Taoist Wan Yuan's will. However, Taoist Wan Yuan didn't dare. Su Qin was right in front of him. If he dared to make any move, he would be crushed by Su Qin just like Wind King and Nine Senses Saber Master. Taoist Wan Yuan's Taoist, back to Taoist Purple Mansion Sacred Grounds? Su Qin touched his chin, as if he had expected this. Taiyin Fairy had long told him about the 6 sacred lands in the Immortal Sect. Among them, the Purple Mansion was the only sacred land with the Essence Soul lineage. Su Qin naturally guessed Taoist Wan Yuan's origin from the Essence Soul technique he displayed in the battle just now. How many peak Divine Ruins experts are there in your Purple Mansion sacred land? Su Qin asked bluntly. With Su Qin's current strength, even if he encountered an Earth Immortal of the Divine Ruins realm, he could still escape unscathed. Only those peak experts of the Divine Ruins realm, who had already begun to come into contact with the power of space, could pose some danger to Su Qin. One had to know that the power grasped by the peak of the Divine Ruins realm was known as the limit of the world. The next step was to break through the void and become a supreme expert. Especially when a peak Divine Ruins expert held the supreme expert's life treasure. He could probably exert 1% of the supreme expert's power with just a raise of his hand. The Purple Mansion Sacred Land now has 3 peak divine ruins experts. Taoist Wan Yuan hesitated for a moment, then gritted his teeth and said, 2 of them are the Grand Elders who live in seclusion in the depths of the Sacred Land, and the Sacred Lord. Other than that, the Purple Mansion Sacred Land also has a direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert, but I'm not sure who it is exactly. Taoist Wan Yuan did not hesitate to reveal the biggest secret of the Purple Mansion Sacred Land. The direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert. It must be known that although there were many descendants who possessed the bloodline of Supreme Experts in the various holy lands of the immortal sects, the number of disciples who could truly awaken their bloodline and inherit a certain ability of the Supreme Expert and become a direct descendant was 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000, and 1 in a million. Any direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert who had awakened their bloodline had unlimited potential. As long as they continued to grow smoothly, they would be able to surpass the peak of the Divine Ruins realm sooner or later and dominate the immortal sect world. However, the 6 sacred lands of the immortal sect were not monolithic. Ordinary genius disciples could not enter the eyes of the sacred lands, but the direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert. This was a power that could control the entire immortal sect world. If a bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert had completely matured, naturally, no sacred lands would dare to provoke them. However, if a bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert who had not yet matured was exposed to the various sacred lands in advance and could not be taken in for their own use, they would probably attract all kinds of assassination attempts. After all, no matter how strong the potential of a bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert was, it was only potential. Once they died prematurely, they would be nothing. Hence, the 6 sacred lands of the immortal sect naturally protected the direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert extremely tightly. Before their strength had completely matured, they would definitely not let others know about it. Taoist Wan Yuan only knew that the current generation of the Purple Mansion Sacred Land had awakened a direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert, because he was a disciple of one of the Grand Elders in the Purple Mansion Sacred Land. However, that was all. As for who exactly it was not something that Taoist Wan Yuan could know. In the entire Purple Mansion Sacred Land, only the Sacred Lord and the 2 Grand Elders knew about the direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert. A direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert, Su Qin had a thoughtful look on his face. According to Taiyin Fairy, before the Supreme Experts of the 6 sacred lands of the immortal sect died of old age, they would spread part of their bloodline to all the disciples in their respective sacred lands. Most of these bloodlines would completely die out, but there was a slight possibility that after dozens of generations of inheritance, the bloodline would suddenly awaken. This was the direct bloodline descendant of the Supreme Expert. The so-called direct bloodline descendant was not the descendant of the Supreme Expert. In fact, the higher the realm, the lower the possibility of having a descendant. This was especially true for the Supreme Experts of the Void-Shattering Realm, who had almost cut off the possibility of having a descendant. However, even if they could not have a descendant, it did not mean that they could not continue the bloodline. Taoist Wan Yuan saw that Su Qin did not speak and immediately said in fear, "Sir, I am not sure who the direct bloodline descendant is." "I know," Su Qin said lightly. Through the great Tao Heart demonic seed art, Su Qin could sense Taoist Wan Yuan's true emotions. Naturally, he was sure that Taoist Wan Yuan was not deliberately hiding anything. This is the Supreme Expert of the Void-Shattering Realm. Su Qin's expression was calm, but his heart was filled with emotions. In martial arts cultivation, even the powerful Earth Immortals could only show off their power for a lifetime. When the 1,000-year limit came, everything would turn to ashes. Nothing would remain. However, the Supreme Experts of the Void-Shattering Realm, even if they died of old age, could still use the power of their bloodline to bless their descendants. Their methods were simply incredible. In a way, a sacred ground that had given birth to a Supreme Expert could easily be passed down for generations as long as they did not seek death. After all, with the bloodline descendants of the Supreme Experts, a direct bloodline descendant would awaken every few hundred or thousand years. The sacred ground would only become stronger and stronger. Not long ago, how did your sect spy on the mortal world? Su Qin pondered for a while and continued to ask. Taoist Wan Yuan smiled bitterly. A few divine lords used the eye of the demon god to spy on the mortal world. It was precisely because the eye of the demon god found no threat in the mortal world that Taoist Wan Yuan volunteered to go to the mortal world. After all, Taoist Wan Yuan was a disciple of one of the Purple Mansion sacred grounds. If Taoist Wan Yuan did not want to, even the Purple Mansion sacred lord would not force him. Thinking of this, Taoist Wan Yuan's expression became even more bitter. If he had known that there was a freak like Su Qin in the mortal world, he would not have come to the mortal world even if he was beaten to death. Eye of the demon god? Su Qin narrowed his eyes. He observed the gate of immortality with the eye of truth and indeed found a huge eye with a pitch-black pupil. The eye of the demon god is a treasure jointly refined by the supreme experts 10,000 years ago, imitating the demon god of the cave world. He can easily spy on the entire mortal world. Taoist Wan Yuan hurriedly told him everything he knew. I see. Su Qin's thoughts were in turmoil. I still don't know how far away it is from the real demon god opening its eyes. Su Qin shook his head slightly and commented. Su Qin was probably the human who understood the demon god of the cave world the best apart from the supreme experts. There were even dozens of drops of demon god blood in Su Qin's system space. Even if Su Qin could not touch or sense these dozens of drops of demon god blood, just by observing with his eyes, he realized how terrifying the demon god of the cave world was. The supreme experts were said to have a lifespan of more than 5,000 years. But the demon gods in the depths of the cave world had set off several wars that invaded the mortal world. They had existed for more than tens of thousands of years. Su Qin even suspected that these demon gods had existed since the birth of the cave world, like eternal and indestructible gods. But now it seems that the reason why I can't touch the demon god blood, and can only see it with my eyes, is probably because the demon god blood did not come from this layer of space at all? Su Qin thought silently. Or, if it weren't for the system sign-in, I wouldn't even be able to see the demon god blood? Su Qin guessed. Forget it. There's no need to think about the demon god now. No matter how powerful the demon god is, there should be great restrictions and they can't intervene in the mortal world. Otherwise, if the demon god chose to descend in person 10,000 years ago, even if there were 10 times more supreme experts, they wouldn't be able to win. Su Qin shook his head and thought, when will the 6 great holy lands of the immortal sect enter the mortal world? Su Qin calmed down, looked at Taoist Wan Yuan and asked. Before Taoist Wan Yuan and the other two entered the mortal world, Su Qin had been here for a long time and had been observing the huge ancient stone gate not far away. According to Su Qin's observation, this huge ancient stone gate should be in the sealing stage. The reason why Taoist Wan Yuan and the other two could enter the mortal world was entirely because of the gap in the seal. And this gap in the seal could only accommodate a few people at a time, and it was extremely difficult. Therefore, if the 6 great holy lands of the immortal sect wanted to enter the mortal world en masse, the first thing they had to do was to open the immortal gate. The seal left by the supreme experts cut off the connection between the mortal world and the immortal gate. But as long as the mortal world's vitality tide passes the 6th critical point, the vitality spiritual vigor on both sides will form a balance. At that time, the immortal gate will naturally be completely opened. Taoist Wan Yuan said immediately. This was what the Divine Lord told him before he left. The 6th critical point of the recovery of the vitality tide? Su Qin's thoughts turned quickly, and he relaxed slightly. The recovery of the vitality tide was only approaching the 2nd critical point, and there were still decades or centuries to go before the 6th critical point. Su Qin had enough time to cultivate. Just as Taoist Wan Yuan was about to speak carefully, Su Qin's expression changed slightly, and he looked at the huge ancient stone gate not far away with a serious expression. Buzz! A huge eye with an unfathomable pitch-black pupil slowly opened. Its terrifying gaze pierced through layers of the void, and it seemed that even the immortal gate could not block it as it slowly looked toward the mortal world. The eye of the demon god? Su Qin muttered to himself. At this moment, Su Qin felt like he was being watched again. It was exactly the same feeling he felt when he was in seclusion in the Black Palace under Chang and City not long ago. Because Su Qin was now close to the stone gate, Su Qin felt even more intense. The eye of the demon god? Taoist Wan Yuan's expression changed slightly. Although he did not feel the eye of the demon god spying on him, he could roughly guess from Su Qin's expression Did the divine lords activate the eye of the demon god again? Taoist Wan Yuan was both happy and worried. It was obvious that the death of the Wind King and the Nine Senses Saber Master, two true realm earth immortals, had infuriated the Wind God Valley and the Heavenly Sword Mountain. They immediately joined forces with the other divine lords to activate the eye of the demon god again, trying to figure out what had happened in the mortal world. Su Qin chuckled. With a thought, the god of war domain covered a 10-meter radius around him. The void within the 10-meter radius was slightly distorted. Su Qin's figure suddenly became illusory, as if he did not exist in the mortal world. Even Taoist Wan Yuan's figure was faintly discernible. Buzz! A majestic wave spread out from the immortal gate. It instantly passed through Su Qin and Taoist Wan Yuan and swept toward the distance. What? Taoist Wan Yuan was shocked. He did not feel the wave of the eye of the demon god spying on the mortal world. However, when Su Qin used the god of war domain to cover him, Taoist Wan Yuan immediately felt as if he had left the mortal world, or rather, he was independent of the mortal world. Sir, did you use this method to avoid the eye of the demon god? Taoist Wan Yuan's mind raced. His heart was suddenly in turmoil. He had originally guessed that Su Qin had used some kind of treasure to avoid the eye of the demon god. However, Su Qin had used his own strength to deceive the eye of the demon god. Chapter 352. Using external forces to avoid the prying eyes of the demon god, and relying on one's own strength to prevent the demon god's eye from detecting, were two completely different concepts. For example, a land immortal of the divine ruin realm with the life treasure of the strongest was enough to sweep through a group of divine ruin realm experts. But could this land immortal of the divine ruin realm be said to be strong? No. It could only be said that the life treasure of the strongest was strong. Even if it was another land immortal holding this life treasure, the result would still be the same. At this moment, Taoist Wan Yuan was shrouded in the war god domain. He didn't feel the aura of any life treasure, but he could easily deceive the demon god's eye. It was simply incredible. The eye of the demon god was a precious treasure created by the combined efforts of many supreme powerhouses. It had the function of monitoring the mortal world. Although the one using the eye of the demon god was not a supreme powerhouse, the power of the treasure itself was enough to see through everything. Buzz! The gaze of the demon god's eye kept sweeping out of the immortal gate. Compared to the previous time when several holy lords jointly activated the demon god's eye to spy on the world, this time it was obviously more serious. The terrifying gaze lingered in the world for more than half an hour before it finally slowly returned to the immortal gate. Too rigid. Su Qin's figure was illusory, shrouded in the war god domain. He quietly watched the demon god's eyes aura gradually disappear and shook his head slightly. If it was the gaze of a demon god from the cave world, not to mention Su Qin hiding in the war god domain, even if he used the war god temple to go deep into the void, he would be discovered. After all, Su Qin's current war god domain couldn't even be considered a prototype. At most, it could only be a world shadow. How could it escape the gaze of a demon god? Although the demon god's eye was far inferior to the gaze of a real demon god, it was still refined by several strongest experts. Logically speaking, even if it couldn't find Su Qin, it could still capture some clues. However, the holy lords who activated the demon god's eye in the immortal gate couldn't exert the true power of the demon god's eye at all. Taoist Wan Yuan stared at the huge ancient stone gate not far away, and his expression changed slightly. He seemed to have thought of something and quickly said, "Lord, let's leave quickly. Otherwise, once the holy lords arrive." Although Taoist Wan Yuan was unwilling, he knew that his life was now in Su Qin's hands. With just a thought, Su Qin could make his ancestral aperture collapse and his primordial spirit extinguish. He couldn't even possess his body. Therefore, Taoist Wan Yuan was sincerely thinking for Su Qin's sake. He wanted to prevent Su Qin from clashing head-on with the sacred masters. In Taoist Wan Yuan's opinion, although Su Qin was powerful and could even escape the detection of the eye of the demon god, there was still a gap between him and the sacred lords who stood at the peak of the small world of immortals. The various divine lords were in charge of the Holy Land and had their own natal cardinal treasures. Unless they encountered a direct descendant of a supreme expert who also had a natal cardinal treasure, they would be able to suppress them. As for the others, they were no match for them at all. The arrival of the Holy Lord? Su Qin smiled and shook his head. They won't come. Won't descend. Taoist Wan Yuan was slightly taken aback. If the Holy Lords were willing to descend, it wouldn't be you true realm cultivators who came to the mortal world this time, Su Qin said lightly. For example, Su Qin wouldn't easily enter the immortal gate at this moment. Before figuring out what was going on in the mortal world, the Holy Lords in the immortal gate wouldn't easily enter the mortal world either. To be able to become a Holy Lord, one had to be at least at the peak of the godly ruins. Such an expert had gone through countless trials and tribulations. Unless it was absolutely necessary, who would let him personally take the risk? If the Holy Lords in the Immortal Gate hadn't activated the Eye of the Demon God, Su Qin would have guessed that the Nine Senses Sabermaster and the Wind King had sent information back to the Immortal Gate before they died. But in the end, the Eye of the Demon God peeped into the mortal world again. The only possibility for the Holy Lords to activate the Eye of the Demon God again was that they still didn't know what was going on in the mortal world, and why the Wind King and the Nine Senses Sabermaster had died. Inside the Immortal Gate, in the palace that floated under the sky, the Saint Sovereigns gathered together again, their expressions solemn. The Wind King and the Nine Senses Sabermaster had died one after another, which raised the Holy Lord's alertness to the highest. They activated the Eye of the Demon God again without hesitation to spy on the mortal world. However, the result this time was no different from the previous time. Even though they had used up several times more energy than the previous time, and used the Eye of the Demon God to spy on the mortal world for an hour, they still didn't find anything. Who did it? The primeval Holy Lord said in a low voice. Although the three people who had entered the mortal world this time weren't from the primeval Holy Ground, the primeval Holy Ground had given them a supreme treasure. The Wind King and the Nine Senses Sabermaster had died, which meant that the supreme treasure had fallen into the hands of others. How could the primeval Holy Lord bear such a loss? For thousands of years, it had always been the primeval Holy Ground that took the treasures of others. When had the supreme treasure of the primeval Holy Ground been taken away by others? Don't panic. Although it's a little troublesome now, it's actually very easy to solve, the Taiyin Holy Lord said slowly as he looked at the others. Oh, very easy to solve? How do you think we should solve it? The eyes of the primeval Holy Lord, the Valley Master of the Wind God Valley, and the others lit up as they looked at the Taiyin Holy Lord. It's very simple. The Taiyin Holy Lord didn't keep them in suspense and said directly, any one of us just needs to go to the mortal world personally. The moment he said that, the expressions of the Sacred Lords changed. The Taiyin Holy Lord was right. The Sacred Lords present were all at the peak of the godly ruins, and had mastered countless inheritances left behind by supreme experts. How could they be compared to the Wind King and the Nine Senses Sabermaster? Although they didn't know who had done it in the mortal world, being able to easily kill the Wind King and the Nine Senses Sabermaster didn't mean that they could do anything to the Sacred Lords. However, although the Taiyin Holy Lord's method was very effective, none of the Sacred Lords present were willing to try it. They were very confident in their own abilities. Unless a supreme expert was born in the mortal world, the Sacred Lords would be able to escape unscathed, even if they couldn't defeat him. But what if? What if they really died in the mortal world like the Wind King and the Nine Senses Sabermaster? Although this possibility was very small, which Sacred Lord present wasn't a sly old fox. Naturally, they didn't want to take this risk. Although the death of a true realm Earth God would make the Sacred Lord's hearts ache, they could still accept it. However, if a Sacred Lord at the peak of the godly ruins died, it would be a great loss to the entire sacred ground. Since the Taiyin Holy Lord has said so, why don't you come to the mortal world yourself? Don't worry. If anything happens in the mortal world, we'll work together to save you. The sect master of the Skyblade Mountain immediately said. If that's the case, pretend that I didn't say anything, the Taiyin Holy Lord said as he shook his head. Purple Mansion Sacred Lord. Is Wan Yuan from your sacred ground still alive? At this moment, the Valley Master of the Wind God Valley turned to look at the Purple Mansion Sacred Lord, who hadn't said a word. No. The Purple Mansion Sacred Lord closed his eyes and sensed for a while before saying, Wan Yuan is the disciple of Fuyao Grand Supreme. He should have used a trump card to barely survive. That's true. The Valley Master of the Wind God Valley nodded slightly. The Purple Mansion sacred ground was the sacred ground of the primordial soul sect. Their methods were strange and unpredictable. One Yuan Daoist was the disciple of the Purple Mansion sacred ground's Grand Supreme. It was very likely that a trace of his primordial soul had escaped and was hiding somewhere. However, without the protection of the supreme treasure, even if one Yuan Daoist survived, he would be at death's door. He wouldn't be able to return to the gate of heaven and tell them what had happened in the mortal world. It's a pity that other than the legendary primordial soul supreme treasures, the other supreme treasures can only be activated with dermic powers. Otherwise, I would want to split a primordial soul avatar and go to the mortal world to take a look. The Valley Master of the Wind God Valley sighed softly. To enter the mortal world, one had to pass through the void tunnel. However, the void tunnel was filled with space fragments. Only supreme treasures and precious treasures that contained the power of space could pass through. Regardless of whether it was supreme treasures or precious treasures, they all required dermic powers to activate. As for the primordial soul avatar, it was completely formed from the primordial soul and naturally didn't have dermic powers. Therefore, it couldn't activate the supreme treasures and pass through the void tunnel. It was said that the Purple Mansion sacred ground had the legendary primordial soul supreme treasures. However, primordial soul supreme treasures were extremely rare. In terms of value, they were almost as valuable as natal supreme treasures. Of course, the Purple Mansion sacred ground wouldn't be willing to hand them over. We sacred lords are the pillars of the sacred ground. We need to guard the gate of heaven and can't leave. However, other than us, you can send your disciples to the mortal world again. Before leaving, let them leave behind a primordial soul avatar. If anything happens, immediately inform us through the primordial soul avatar. The Mountain Master of the Heavenly Blade Mountain's expression changed. Before the Wind King and the Nine Senses Saber Master died, they had rushed out with their primordial soul avatars. However, before they could say what had happened, their true bodies died and their primordial soul avatars dissipated. Therefore, the Mountain Master of the Heavenly Blade Mountain suggested this method. If there were sacred lords guarding the Wind King and the Nine Senses Saber Master before their primordial soul avatars dissipated, even if they couldn't save them, they could at least find out what had happened to the Nine Senses Saber Master in the mortal world and who had killed them. However, this method also had a flaw. That was, the disciples who were sent out to the human world would have no chance of surviving. However, it was better to let the disciples die than to let the sacred lords personally take the risk. Actually, there's no need to exhaust the disciples of the sacred grounds. In the world of heaven, other than the 6 sacred grounds, there are also countless ordinary living beings. Over the past 10,000 years, many of these ordinary living beings have embarked on the path of martial arts. Now, there are quite a few sects that are quite powerful. The Grandine Sacred Lord said slowly. Before the end of the previous vital chi tide, the various supreme experts had broken through the void and opened up the small world of heaven. Not only did they bring their own inheritances into the small world of heaven, but they also brought in countless living beings. After all, even the 6 sacred grounds needed new blood. After 10,000 years of reproduction, the living beings living in the small world of heaven numbered in the billions. Moreover, some of the living beings with good talent were unwilling to join the 6 sacred grounds and were restricted. Thus, they set up their own sects and lived freely. The 6 sacred grounds naturally turned a blind eye to this. A batch of these sects would disappear every few hundred years. Without the heritage of the sacred grounds, how could they survive for so long? That's right. I've heard that there's a sect called the Myriad Transformation sect that was founded by the Myriad Transformation Spiritual Master. This Myriad Transformation Spiritual Master is already an Earth immortal at the peak of the Origin Returning Realm. The Valley Master of the Wind God Valley said slowly. He had once cherished talent and wanted to accept this Myriad Transformation Spiritual Master as his disciple. After all, to be able to cultivate to the peak of the Origin Returning Realm without relying on any sacred grounds resources, one could imagine his talent. Unfortunately, the Myriad Transformation Spiritual Master was arrogant by nature and thought that he could enter the ruins of God by himself. Thus, he naturally ignored the Wind God Valley's recruitment. The Valley Master of the Wind God Valley was somewhat annoyed by this, so he chose to watch coldly from the sidelines. He wanted to see how the myriad transformation spiritual master would enter the ruins of God. One must know that to enter the ruins of God from the origin returning realm, one must not only rely on oneself, but also have to come into contact with the power of space. In the entire small world of heaven, only the 6 sacred grounds had mastered the power of space. The valley master of the wind god valley thought that the myriad transformation spiritual master wanted to enter the ruins of God with his own strength. Then let this myriad transformation spiritual master take a trip to the human world on our behalf. The great beginning sacred Lord nodded slightly and said softly, "But be careful not to force this myriad transformation spiritual master too much. We have to give him some benefits so that he is willing." The great beginning sacred Lord said thoughtfully, with the power of their sacred Lord, they could indeed force the myriad transformation spiritual master to take the initiative to go to the human world. But this way, the myriad transformation spiritual master's heart would be filled with resentment. If the other party betrayed them after entering the human world, wouldn't it be like drawing water with a bamboo basket? Therefore they couldn't force him. They had to give him some benefits so that he would be willing. Outside the immortal gate, Su Qin waited for a while and realized that there was no movement from the huge ancient stone door. He realized that his guess was right. The sacred lords of the immortal gate really didn't dare to come out. In fact, this was human nature. Who would easily put themselves in danger when they didn't know the depth of the situation? Of course, there were a small number of people who were straightforward and impulsive and didn't care about life and death. But to be able to cultivate to the peak of the ruins of God and become the sacred Lord, they were obviously old foxes who weighed the pros and cons. This stone door. Su Qin slowly walked through the stone door and looked up. The stone door was dark yellow, but vaguely, it revealed a kind of aura that could tear the world apart. Obviously, there was a method left behind by a supreme expert on the stone door. What a pity. Su Qin shook his head slightly and gave up the idea of destroying the stone door. If he could destroy the stone door, it would be equivalent to completely severing the connection between the world of the immortal gate and the human world. In this way, the 6 sacred lands of the immortal gate would be completely trapped in the world of the immortal gate, and would never be able to return to the human world. Then, when he was strong enough, he could recommunicate with the immortal gate and go in to sign in. But this huge ancient stone door was obviously not simple. Even if Su Qin hadn't made a move, he could see that the aura flowing above it was not something that an earth immortal level expert could shake. Therefore, he didn't even bother to make a move. But if I step into the peak of the ruins of God, I might be able to destroy the stone door with the first move of the Buddha's palm. I, the unique and righteous? Su Qin's thoughts fluctuated. Even if I can't destroy it, I can use the second move, pure land in the palm, to seal it forever. Chapter 353. The Buddha's palm had a total of 9 moves. There was no difference in quality between the 9 moves, but they focused on different aspects. For example, the first move, I, the unique and righteous, was a pure offensive divine palm. As for the second move, pure land in the palm, it was a sealing divine palm. Unfortunately, the huge ancient stone door in front of Su Qin was too extraordinary. Although it was just standing there, it exuded an aura that could tear heaven and earth. If Su Qin attacked it, he would definitely suffer a backlash. "My lord, are you okay?" Taoist Wan Yuan saw Su Qin staring at the stone door, and thought that Su Qin was worried about something. He couldn't help but comfort him. "Your lord's strength is enough to dominate a region, even in the immortal gate. Even if the sacred lords really come, they might not be able to do anything to you." Although the sacred lords were all at the peak of the divine ruins and had their own natal supreme treasures, if Su Qin wanted to hide, just this unknown domain that could hide from the eye of the demon god was enough to give the sacred lords a headache. Taoist Wan Yuan naturally didn't know that Su Qin's thoughts at this moment were to destroy or seal this stone door. If Taoist Wan Yuan knew Su Qin's thoughts, he would definitely be dumbfounded. This stone door was built by the supreme experts and was specially used to lock the coordinates between the mortal world and the immortal gate world. For thousands of years, countless spatial storms had crashed into this stone door, but it didn't shake at all. In terms of sturdiness, this stone door had probably surpassed the natal supreme treasures. Even if the supreme experts attacked, they might not be able to destroy this stone door. Su Qin ignored Taoist Wan Yuan's worries. At this moment, most of his attention was focused on this huge ancient stone door. This stone door. Su Qin looked at the huge ancient stone door not far away and suddenly thought of something. This stone door itself has experienced at least 10,000 years, and its material is rare. Maybe it contains a lot of Tao connotation ? Thinking of this, Su Qin circled around the huge ancient stone door. After confirming that he didn't miss anything, he said in his heart, "System, sign in for me. Congratulations to the host for signing in successfully. You have received the World Tree Seed." A cold mechanical voice suddenly sounded in Su Qin's ears. World Tree Seed. Su Qin's eyes widened in disbelief. Although he didn't know what the World Tree Seed was, just the word world was enough to tell him that the treasure he got this time was extraordinary. In the blink of an eye, Su Qin's mind quickly sank into the system space. Soon he found a fist-sized seed in the corner. This seed was chaotic and slowly rotated. It was as bright and deep as the void. Su Qin merely looked at it, and he felt as if he could see a world being nurtured within the seed. Once the seed of the world tree takes root and sprouts, it will grow into a world tree and open up a real big world, Su Qin thought to himself. Before seeing the world tree seed, the system had already transmitted everything about the seed to Su Qin's mind. It was precisely because of this that Su Qin realized just how terrifying this world tree seed was. It could open up a real big world. Even tens of thousands of years ago, when the various supreme powerhouses joined forces to break through the void, what they opened up was only an incomplete small world. They relied on plundering endless vitality, spiritual vigor, and nomological Tao fragments from the mortal world to survive until now. But this world tree seed was said to be able to truly open up a big world? How incredible was this? Although Su Qin cultivated the War God catalog and condensed the War God domain, he could also evolve a world when cultivated to the extreme. But even Su Qin himself didn't know if he could reach that step. The so-called evolving world was just the theoretical limit of the War God catalog. But even so, the Battle God catalog was something that even the supreme expert Ho Yuan could not obtain. And now this world tree seed was said to be able to grow into a world tree sooner or later, as long as there was enough time, creating a true great world. This was simply astonishing. If there were still supreme powerhouses in the current world who knew that Su Qin had such a world tree seed in his hands, they would probably risk their lives to snatch it. But why do I feel that this world tree seed is so familiar? Su Qin looked at the slowly rotating world tree seed in the system space and suddenly felt a little surprised. Su Qin was very sure that before today, he had never seen any treasures related to the world tree seed, but now he felt that it was strangely familiar. Is this the cave world? Images flashed through Su Qin's mind one after another. As a true realm land immortal, how powerful was his memory? Almost in an instant, Su Qin had recalled everything that had happened since he stepped into the martial Tao, and finally stopped at the cave world. To be precise, it was the branches of the ancient demon tree in the Demon Cloud City, Cathode City, and several other large cities in the cave world. The cave world was not like the mortal world, where there were many holy lands and great sections. The cave world was divided according to domains, and within each large domain, there were hundreds and thousands of large cities. And in each large city there was a branch of the ancient demon tree. At this moment, the feeling that this world tree seed gave Su Qin was that it was very similar to a branch of the ancient demon tree. In fact, this similarity was not in terms of aura. A branch of the ancient demon tree could gather monstrous demonic energy, while this world tree seed was chaotic and pure. Not to mention the similarity, the two were completely different. But instinctively, Su Qin believed that the world tree seed and the ancient demon tree's branches were essentially similar. Could it be that the ancient demon tree in the depths of the cave world is a world tree? Su Qin narrowed his eyes slightly. One of Su Qin's incarnations stayed in the cave world all year round, so naturally, he had heard a lot of rumors about the ancient demon tree. It was said that this ancient demon tree was as tall as heaven and earth. There was a saying that the entire cave world was supported by the ancient demon tree. If it weren't for the ancient demon tree, the cave world would have collapsed long ago. Even the high and mighty demon gods, who were above everything, lived on a branch of the ancient demon tree all year round. From this, one could see how incredible the ancient demon tree was. Originally, Su Qin thought that the ancient demon tree should be a demonic treasure refined by the demon gods. But now it seems that if the ancient demon tree in the cave world was a world tree, then the relationship between the so-called demon gods and the ancient demon tree was probably not what Su Qin had imagined. Forget it. It's too early for me to think about this. Su Qin's thoughts turned quickly and finally he slowly calmed down. Whether the ancient demon tree in the depths of the cave world was a world tree or not, it had nothing to do with Su Qin. Now the most important thing for Su Qin to consider was how to make this world tree seed take root and grow as much as possible. Next, Su Qin waited until the next day to confirm that this huge ancient stone gate could no longer sign in before preparing to return to Chang'an City. What a pity. Su Qin was slightly regretful. Originally, Su Qin was prepared to get some treasures from the stone gate. Even if they were not as good as the world tree seed, he could still get some supreme treasures. But it seemed that the sign-in for the world tree seed had exhausted all the Dao accumulation on the stone gate, causing Su Qin's idea of continuing to sign in to become empty talk. However, just this world tree seed alone is better than countless life treasures. Although Su Qin was regretful, he was already satisfied. One must know that the world tree seed was nurturing a complete world. How could a mere life treasure compare to it? Leave with me. Su Qin glanced at Daoist Wan Yuan and hesitated for a while, but in the end he didn't have the intention to kill him. This wasn't because Su Qin was a saint, but because Daoist Wan Yuan was in the true realm of the Essence Soul realm. The Essence Soul realm was rare to begin with, let alone the true realm. If he kept Daoist Wan Yuan, he might have a use for him in the future. In addition, Su Qin had already planted a wisp of Essence Soul power in the depths of Daoist Wan Yuan's ancestral aperture. Through the great Dao Heart demonic seed art, Su Qin could decide Daoist Wan Yuan's life and death with a thought. Yes, Daoist Wan Yuan didn't know that he had just walked through the gates of hell. He followed Su Qin cautiously and headed towards Chang'an City. Several hours later, Su Qin and Daoist Wan Yuan arrived at the palace. Senior Wan Yuan. Taiyin Fairy was stunned when she saw Daoist Wan Yuan. She couldn't believe it. Although Taiyin Fairy was the saintest to be of the Taiyin Holy Land, Daoist Wan Yuan's status wasn't low either. He was the disciple of the Purple Mansion Holy Land Supreme Fuyao, and was in the true realm of the Essence Soul realm. In terms of status, he wasn't inferior to Taiyin Fairy at all. It's me. Daoist Wan Yuan's expression was slightly complicated. It's good that you know each other. Now let's catch up. Su Qin glanced at Daoist Wan Yuan and Taiyin Fairy. He didn't stop them from talking. Instead, he took a step forward and disappeared on the spot. Whether it was Daoist Wan Yuan or Taiyin Fairy, their lives were in Su Qin's hands. Even their thoughts could be vaguely sensed by the great Dao Heart demonic seed art. Su Qin was naturally relieved. In the majestic underground palace of Chang'an City, now that I've just stepped into the true realm, it'll be difficult for me to take another step forward in a short period of time, Su Qin thought to himself as he sat cross-legged. As for the Buddha's palm, I can continue to study it. But unless I become an ultimate expert and master the third move, it'll be difficult for me to make a qualitative change. As for the War God catalog and the Great Sun portrait, if I continue to cultivate, I'll need a lot of resources. I don't have any space crystals, fire element divine pills, and so on. Su Qin suddenly realized that he had fallen into a bottleneck and couldn't make any progress. Sigh. In the end, every step of the martial path is difficult. I don't know how those supreme experts cultivate. Su Qin sighed. He had long expected the difficulty of the Earth God Immortal realm. Although there were only 3 levels in the Earth God Immortal realm, the Spirit Severing Stage, the True Realm, and the Final Divine Ruins, compared to the 9 levels of the Myth Realm, it seemed much simpler. But in terms of difficulty, the former was much more difficult than the latter. The cultivation of the Myth Realm was gradual. As long as one took it slowly, with enough talent and opportunities, one would sooner or later enter the peak of the Myth Realm. But the Earth God Immortal realm, not to mention the Spirit Severing Stage and the True Realm, just the spatial power that one needed to comprehend in the Divine Ruins realm was illusory. Although the spatial power was everywhere, and even mortal ants could come into contact with it, who knew how to comprehend it and how to break it? Let's look at the World Tree Seed. Su Qin calmed himself down. With a thought, a chaotic seed appeared in front of him. In addition to this World Tree Seed, Su Qin also obtained a pagoda-shaped supreme treasure from signing in at the immortal sect. However, that pagoda-shaped supreme treasure was the supreme treasure of the Great Beginning Holy Land. There was a mark left behind by the Great Beginning Sacred Lord in it. If Su Qin wanted to use it, he would have to consume a lot of worlds to erase the mark inside. How should this seed germinate? Su Qin looked at the slowly spinning world tree seed in front of him and suddenly felt a headache. If an ordinary seed wanted to germinate, it would naturally be planted in the ground and absorb the nutrients of the earth. However, the world tree seed was a seed that could open up a great world. How could it need to absorb the nutrients of the earth like an ordinary seed? Let's try the vitality spiritual vigor? With a thought, Su Qin instantly gathered the vitality spiritual vigor within 100 miles and floated in Su Qin's palm. Then, under Su Qin's control, it all surged into the world tree seed. Unfortunately, no matter how rich the vitality spiritual vigor was, it would automatically evaporate when it was 3 feet away from the world tree seed. The vitality spiritual vigor is useless. Su Qin had already expected this. Next, Su Qin tried various methods, but they were all useless. In the end, Su Qin directly forced out a drop of blood essence from his arm and landed on the world tree seed. This time, the world tree seed clearly reacted. This chaotic seed spun and devoured Su Qin's drop of blood essence. However, there was nothing. Even if Su Qin released some more blood essence, it was useless. However, Su Qin's only gain was that he seemed to vaguely sense the world tree seed. He could feel the surging vitality in the seed. If I had this vitality, I would probably be able to live for 100,000 years. Su Qin exclaimed in his heart. Just as Su Qin was cultivating and thinking about how to make the world tree seed take root and germinate, in the blink of an eye, a year had passed. In this year, the recovery of the vitality tide of heaven and earth became more and more turbulent. In a trance, the vast and endless vitality sea was rolling, leading the vitality tide of heaven and earth to rise continuously. Finally, it suddenly reached a critical point. Buzz! The entire world was shaking. If someone stood above the 9 heavens, they would find that the entire battlefield was like a prehistoric beast, swallowing and spitting out endless vitality chi and spiritual vigor. This is. In the palace, in front of the East Palace's right spring square, Taiyin Fairy looked at the sky and whispered to herself, "Is the second critical point of the recovery of the vitality tide coming?" At the same time, in the black majestic palace under Chang'an City, Su Qin, who was sitting cross-legged, suddenly opened his eyes and looked up. It's finally here. Chapter 354. The second critical point of the recovery of the vitality tide? Su Qin sat cross-legged in the majestic black hall under Chang'an City. His expression was calm, but there was a hint of anticipation in the depths of his eyes. The vitality chi of heaven and earth was like a tide, rising and falling at times. In the past 10,000 years, the vitality tide had been constantly falling. It was not until a few decades ago that the fall gradually eased, and the vitality tide began to reverse and become a recovery. The recovery of the vitality tide was not achieved overnight, but gradually. According to the information that Su Qin obtained from the overseas major sects and immortal sects, the recovery of the vitality tide was divided into 9 critical points. Once the 9 critical points of the recovery of the vitality tide were passed, one could enter the heyday of the recovery of the vitality tide. That was the true golden age of cultivation. In the previous era of the vitality tide, most of the supreme experts of the void-shattering realm were born during the heyday of the recovery of the vitality tide. The recovery of the vitality tide was not only the recovery of the vitality chi, but also the change of the environment of heaven and earth, as well as the activation of the laws of Great Tao. Why did the 6 great holy lands in the immortal sects want to return to the mortal world? For the vitality chi? For the vitality chi? None of them. There were several measures left behind by the supreme experts in the immortal sects, and there was no lack of vitality chi at all. However, the laws of Great Tao were something that the supreme experts could not affect. If the many experts in the immortal sects were content with the status quo and did not intend to break through that step, it would naturally not affect them whether they returned to the mortal world or not. However, who could cultivate to the peak of the divine ruins realm did not desire to break through the void. Who did not desire to become a supreme expert? There are a total of 9 critical points from the recovery of the vitality tide to the heyday, and these 9 critical points all contain great opportunities, or treasures condensed by heaven and earth, or related to the previous vitality tide. As the number of critical points advances, the great opportunities represented will become more and more precious. Su Qin's thoughts fluctuated as he thought quickly in his heart. This was also the reason why he deliberately went to the Immortal Gate to block the entrance. If the 6 great sacred grounds in the Immortal Gate successfully sent people into the mortal world, Su Qin would not be afraid of ordinary True Realm experts. However, if a land immortal of the Divine Ruins realm came, Su Qin would have a headache. Decades ago, during the first vitality tide's critical point, the heaven and earth naturally formed a fire elemental source. Su Qin thought to himself, I wonder what kind of great opportunities will appear during this critical point. The source of fire element was one of the sources of the 5 elements. It could help a myth realm warrior enter the divine immortal realm more smoothly. It could be said that it was a rare treasure. However, even if it was the source of fire element, it was only a product of the first critical point of the recovery of the vitality tide. It was nothing compared to the opportunities that appeared at the later critical points. After all, regardless of whether it was the fire elemental source or the other 5 elemental sources, they were only useful to those in the myth realm at most. Perhaps they would also have some effect on some earth immortals. After that, they would face the opportunity that would appear at the boundary point. It was very likely that it would be related to how to break through and become an omnipotent master. Why were there so many supreme experts during the peak of the previous vitality tide? It was not because of the great opportunities that appeared at the previous 9 critical points. It has just begun to cross the critical point. There's no need to rush for the time being. Su Qin carefully sensed for a while and shook his head. However, the seed of the world tree, which had been motionless for the past year, has changed a little now. Su Qin's heart stirred, and a chaotic seed suddenly appeared in front of him. It was the seed of the world tree that Su Qin had obtained from signing in outside the Immortal Gate. It was said that when it grew to a certain extent, it could open up a great world. Ever since Su Qin's drop of blood essence was swallowed by it, Su Qin could vaguely feel the aura inside the seed. At this moment, as the vitality tide in the outside world reached a certain critical point, the huge vitality inside the seed had clearly become a little more active. Could it be that the seed of the world tree needs the vitality tide to recover to a certain extent if it wants to take root and germinate? Su Qin's face was thoughtful. Just as Su Qin was pondering over the seed of the world tree, the outside world was already in an uproar. Even if the vast majority of people did not know that the vitality tide was about to reach the second critical point, they could faintly feel that the world had begun to change. The vitality spirit gradually became richer, and many martial artists who had been trapped in the bottleneck for decades and whose vitality had long declined and had no hope of breaking through, felt their aura being pulled and naturally stepped into that step. Ha 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 ha. I actually became a legend? This is a legend. A legend who can fight against 1,000,000 people. An old man with disheveled hair rushed out of a street in Chang, and city crazily and flew into the air with a powerful aura. This old man with disheveled hair was originally a peak grade 1 great grandmaster who had transformed 3 times, but he was unable to grasp the wisp of vitality in the dark. He originally thought that he could only wait until he died of old age, so he lived in seclusion on a street in Chang'an City. But to the old man's surprise, after sleeping for a while, he naturally grasped the wisp of vitality in the dark and smoothly stepped into the myth realm. I don't have to die. The myth realm has 500 years of Shoyuan. Before the old man with disheveled hair could rejoice, he was directly detained by the Forbidden Army who rushed over. You disrupted the order and were imprisoned for 10 years. The captain of the Forbidden Army coldly glanced at the old man and directly suppressed him, then sent him back to the prison. This scene made the other martial artists who had just broken through but had not yet rejoiced feel as if cold water had been poured over their heads, and they quickly calmed down. They suddenly remembered that this was Chang'an City, the capital of the Empire of Tang. Over the years, there were no less than hundreds and thousands of myth realm martial artists who had joined them, and there was no lack of peak myth realm martial artists. A martial artist who had just entered the myth realm dared to fly into the air. It was tantamount to courting death. Ignorant. A young man in white sitting by the window of a restaurant shook his head and said as he looked at the old man who was being escorted away, "The Celestial of the Empire of Tang is overseeing the palace. A mere myth realm martial artist dares to release his aura. How foolish," the young man in white said disdainfully. "Young master, is the Tang Guotian really that strong?" A beautiful woman sitting opposite the young man in white asked curiously. "He's more than strong." The young man in white was silent for a while. He looked in the direction of the palace and said softly, "The Tang Guotian might have reached the end of the Earth Immortal Realm by now." The end of the Earth Immortal Realm? The beautiful woman's eyes widened. She was not even in the myth realm, let alone the Earth Immortal Realm. As for the so-called end of the Earth Immortal Realm, to the beautiful woman it was like a book from heaven. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, several months had passed. In these few months, nearly 1,000 myth realm martial artists were born in the Empire of Tang. It should be known that a few decades ago, it was rare for a myth realm martial artist to appear in hundreds of years. But now, nearly 1,000 myth realm martial artists were born in just a few months, and the speed was still accelerating. However, although so many experts were born suddenly, it did not have much impact on the Empire of Tang. The Emperor of Tang had already ordered hundreds of myth realm martial artists to patrol all over the country. Once they found a new myth realm martial artist, they would be invited back to Chang and city and asked if they were willing to join the Empire of Tang. If they were willing, everything would be fine. If they were unwilling, they would set up all kinds of rules and then be released. After these martial artists who had just entered the myth realm saw the strength of the Empire of Tang, especially when several patriarchs of the overseas sects showed up in person in order to curry favor with Su Qin, they naturally did not dare to have any other thoughts. Heroes broke the rules with martial arts. That was built on the premise that the dynasty was declining. But now the Empire of Tang had Su Qin in charge. Even if a group of Earth Immortals appeared, they would have to abide by his rules, let alone some myth realm martial artists. On a certain day, in the black towering hall under Chang and city, Su Qin opened his eyes again and disappeared from where he was. When Su Qin appeared again, he was on a hill. This hill was hundreds of miles away from Chang and city. Because a large amount of spiritual vigor was drawn away by the formation of Chang and city, there were no martial artists living in seclusion here. This is. Su Qin looked in a direction not far away, and his face was slightly solemn. Where Su Qin's gaze fell, the space was faintly distorted and rotated, as if it was connected to an unknown place. Void passage, a void passage is forming here. At this moment, a cold voice suddenly sounded, and there was shock in the voice. Void passage? Su Qin looked at Taiyin Fairy and Taoist Wan Yuan, who hurried over and asked with a frown, "Master." Taiyin Fairy bowed slightly to Su Qin and said in a low voice, "If I'm not wrong, the critical point of this vitality tide will form a void passage that leads to other small worlds." A void passage that leads to other small worlds? Su Qin repeated in a low voice, and he was deep in thought. So far, the only small world that Su Qin knew of was the small world of the Celestial Gate. And the small world of the Celestial Gate was created by the joint efforts of several supreme experts 10,000 years ago. Other than that, strictly speaking, the War God Temple was also a small world. The space inside was vast, and it was almost comparable to half of the Empire of Tang. Master, in the previous Vitality Tide era, many supreme experts were born. These supreme experts roamed the universe, and many of them went to the extraterritorial void. And before these supreme experts went to the extraterritorial void, they would leave behind some treasures to bless their descendants, Taoist Wan Yuan immediately explained. In the eyes of the supreme experts who could break through space, the so-called human world could no longer restrain them. The supreme experts completely had the strength to roam the extraterritorial void. And to the supreme experts, their relatives in the same generation were basically all dead. Perhaps there were some bloodline descendants, but after so many generations, their feelings would definitely have faded. Therefore, most of the supreme experts would choose to leave the human world and travel to the extraterritorial void. But no matter what, the supreme experts were born in the human world and grew up in the human world. Even if their relatives were all dead, they still had some thoughts about the human world. Therefore, before they left, the supreme experts would often leave behind some treasures. And the supreme experts' methods naturally wouldn't just leave the treasures in a certain place. Instead, they would break through the void and create a new small world. They would place the treasures inside and wait for the fated person in the future. Of course, these small worlds created by the supreme experts naturally couldn't be compared to the small world created by the joint efforts of several supreme experts like the Celestial Gate. But they were still considered vast and at least the size of the Empire of Tang. Generally speaking, these small worlds would be hidden somewhere in the depths of the void. Even if it were other utmost powerful beings, it would be hard for them to find them. After all, the void was layered. Even if it were an utmost powerful being, there was still the possibility of getting lost. I see. Hearing this, Su Qin nodded slightly. If one day he became a supreme expert and chose to leave this world, he would probably leave behind some things to prove that he had once existed. It's just a pity that the small worlds created by the supreme experts of the past gradually wandered in the depths of the void as the world passed. Taoist Wan Yuan said slowly. It was easy to open up a small world, but it was difficult to completely fix this small world in the vicinity of the human world. After all, the void was not static and was constantly fluctuating. If the Supreme Masters were still around, they would naturally be able to resist these fluctuations. However, if the Supreme Masters were to leave, the so-called small world would also gradually drift away as the spatial fluctuations attacked again and again. The Celestial Gate was able to maintain the passage to the human world, because of the huge ancient stone gate created by the joint efforts of several supreme experts. It was used as a coordinate to connect the two worlds. In the previous era of the Vitality Tide, a small world like this is definitely an unprecedented opportunity. It contains the treasures left behind by a supreme expert, including the supreme expert's inheritance and supreme treasures. There might even be one or two life supreme treasures. Taoist Wan Yuan's tone became heated. For the supreme experts who were about to leave the human world and explore the void, they would basically choose to leave their inheritance behind. After all, inheritance wasn't a treasure. Could be copied and there was no loss. Other than inheritance, the supreme experts would also leave behind some supreme treasures. As for life supreme treasures, it depended on whether the supreme expert was rich or not. The inheritance of a supreme expert. Taoist Wan Yuan looked at the gradually distorting void not far away and muttered to himself. The inheritance of a supreme expert was an immeasurable treasure in the eyes of any expert, because it contained the process of how to break through the void. Even for other supreme experts, it was extremely valuable. Although the paths of the supreme experts were different, they could learn from each other, and there might be qualitative changes. Not bad. Su Qin's eyes lit up as he listened to Taoist Wan Yuan. He wasn't very interested in the inheritance of a supreme expert, but a small world that had existed for at least 10,000 years. The Tao connotation accumulated in it was at least not inferior to that stone gate, right? If Su Qin signed in there, he would definitely gain a lot. Taoist Wan Yuan looked carefully and said in a low voice, "This void passage hasn't completely formed yet. Judging from the fluctuations, it will take a few months. If you want to enter, it's best to wait a few months." Chapter 355. Before entering the Nine Swords world, let's take a look first. Su Qin carefully looked at the void passage, then opened the eyes of truth, operated the celestial eyes, and looked towards the end of the void passage. Previously, Su Qin observed the Nine Swords world with the eyes of truth, but because the void passage had not yet taken shape, he could only roughly know the information of the Nine Swords world itself, which was the information left by the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords world. As for the specific information inside the Nine Swords world, he was not clear. But now it was different. Now that the void passage has completely stabilized, if Su Qin observes with the eyes of truth, he will naturally get more information than last time. This is like looking at the same thing from a distance of 10,000 meters and 100 meters. The latter will definitely be much clearer than the former. Wang! A world exuding azure light emerged, and at the same time all kinds of qi gushed out. There are living beings in the Nine Swords world? Su Qin's heart moved. The qi that he observed with the eyes of truth can only be emitted by living beings. In other words, there are a large number of living beings in the Nine Swords world. Not only that, Su Qin also found that the strength of the living beings in the Nine Swords world was not weak, and the strongest had reached the peak origin realm. Interesting. A smile appeared on Su Qin's face. If there are divine ruins realm living beings in the Nine Swords world, Su Qin may consider whether to enter or not, but the origin realm, even if it is the peak origin realm, how can it compare to Su Qin? Next, Su Qin carefully looked at it several times, and finally confirmed the approximate level of the Nine Swords world, before summoning the War God Temple. A towering and vast palace appeared in front of Su Qin. Under the fluctuations of the palace's aura, even the void began to solidify. There are only two ways to pass through the void channel. One is to reach the supreme powerhouse realm and master the power of space, which makes it easy to pass through the void channel. The other way is to use a treasure or some treasures that contain the power of space to resist the space fragments in the process of passing through the void channel. For example, when Taiyin Fairy and her party descended to the world, they used the Taiyin token to pass through the void channel, while Taoist Wan Yuan and the others used a tower-shaped defensive treasure. Apart from this, there is no other way. Even the direct descendants of the supreme powerhouse who have awakened their bloodline cannot pass through the void channel with their own strength. Under the supreme powerhouse, the power of space is unsolvable. This is an iron law. Of course, other creatures cannot break this iron law, but Su Qin has dozens of methods to pass through the void channel under the supreme powerhouse realm. For example, cultivating the great sun painting to great accomplishment and transforming into the fire divine beast, the three-legged golden crow. Although the three-legged golden crow is not the strongest space divine beast, its body is extremely powerful. Even if it is only a young three-legged golden crow, it is not something that space fragments can do anything to. Also, Su Qin can cultivate the war god's domain to the extreme and condense a world, which can also easily pass through the void channel. Or Su Qin can use the Buddha's palm second style pure land in the palm to seal himself, and then use the power of the seal to pass through the void channel and so on. And Su Qin chose the simplest one, which is to directly ride the War God's Temple through the void channel. The War God's Temple is a super large space magic tool, and its value exceeds the life treasure of a supreme powerhouse. Riding the War God's Temple through the void channel is simply a humiliation to the War God's Temple. Su Qin took a step forward and entered the War God's Temple. Then the entire War God's Temple turned into a stream of light and rushed into the void channel. Is this the void channel? The area outside the human world? Su Qin stood in the War God's Temple, but scenes appeared in front of him. This was a vast space. Even the magnificent and majestic War God's Temple was like a speck of dust in this space. In the distance there were faint spots of light. Apart from these, there was nothing else in this vast space. No wonder a small number of powerhouses did not choose to leave the human world and go to the void. So the void is like this? Su Qin was slightly shocked. Even separated by the War God's Temple, Su Qin could still feel the endless loneliness and coldness. Although the powerhouses can survive in the void, compared to the gorgeous world of the human world, the void is not even a desert. If they survive in this environment for hundreds or thousands of years, even the powerhouses will go crazy. However, according to ancient records, the distance in the void is different from that in reality. If the powerhouses want to go to a place, they only need to break space, enter the void, and then take a few steps in that direction. When they return to reality again, they have already crossed tens of thousands of li. Su Qin thought to himself. In the void, there is no distinction between up and down, left and right. Similarly, the span of distance is also very different from that of the human world. However, the goal of my trip is not the depths of the void, but there? Su Qin's eyes turned and looked in the direction of the void passage. He saw a slightly invisible cyan light slowly flickering. It was the Nine Swords world connected to the void passage. Speed up. Su Qin immediately controlled the War God's Temple and headed towards the Nine Swords world. At the same time, Nine Swords world. There were 3 rays of light, 1 in front and 2 behind. The ray of light in front fled frantically, while the 2 behind chased after it. Why? Realizing that he couldn't escape, the escaping light suddenly stopped and stared straight at the 2 escaping lights that were chasing after him. Your Nine Swords Holy Land has cut off the world's luck for 50,000 years, and you are already invincible in the world. Why don't you give us rogue cultivators a way out? After this pause, the figure of an extremely disheveled old man appeared. The Nine Swords world was created by the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords. 50,000 years ago, the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords did not leave immediately, but retreated in this world for hundreds of years. For hundreds of years, the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords deeply felt the loneliness of the world, so he moved some of the creatures in the human world to the Nine Swords world. After the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords left, some of these creatures used the techniques passed down by the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords to forcibly occupy the place where the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords went into seclusion. They also grasped some of the techniques left behind by the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords, and they became known as the Nine Swords Holy Land, overlooking the entire Nine Swords world. However, although the Nine Swords Holy Land was high and mighty, the entire world did not only consist of people from the Nine Swords Holy Land. There were also rogue cultivators outside the Holy Land. Rogue cultivators were either unwilling to join the Holy Land, or they did not meet the requirements to join the Holy Land, so they could only live independently outside the Holy Land. As a result, the disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land did not treat rogue cultivators as humans. Under the pressure of the Nine Swords Holy Land, ordinary rogue cultivators had no chance of resisting. Chun Yongzi. The two streaks of light stopped at the same time and looked at the old man indifferently. Hand over the spiritual herb and become a slave of the Holy Land for 200 years, and I will let you live. To these two disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land, it was as if having Chun Yongzi as a slave was already a great gift. Hand over the spiritual herb? 200 years of slavery? Chun Yongzi was stunned for a moment before he laughed maniacally. You're forcing this old Taoist to die. This old Taoist was the one who first discovered the spiritual herb. It has nothing to do with the Nine Swords Holy Land. Natural treasures belong to the virtuous. What right does the Nine Swords Holy Land have to ask this old Taoist to hand it over? Chun Yongzi asked word by word. This spiritual herb was discovered by Chun Yongzi 80 years ago. At that time, this spiritual herb had yet to mature. In order to wait for this spiritual herb to mature, Chun Yongzi forcibly waited for 80 years. During this period, he had expended an unknown amount of energy. Finally, 80 years had passed and the spiritual herb had matured. However, just as Chun Yongzi's face was filled with joy, he did not know when the news had leaked out and he met two disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land who happened to pass by. These two disciples of the Holy Land demanded that Chun Yongzi hand over the spiritual herb. Of course, Chun Yongzi was unwilling. He had spent 80 years and did not have much lifespan left. He was waiting for this stock of spirit medicine to break through and extend his lifespan. How could he hand it over? Even if the other party was a disciple of the Holy Land. Treasures of heaven and earth belong to the virtuous? When the two disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land heard this, a mocking smile appeared on their faces. Chun Yongzi, didn't your master tell you that in this world our Nine Swords Holy Land is the virtue, the Tao? If it weren't for your contribution in cultivating the spiritual herb, you wouldn't even have the chance to be a slave of our Holy Land. But now, since you refused, you can go to hell. The two disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land had a cold expression. Suddenly, a sharp sword light appeared and slashed at Chun Yongzi. Not good. Chun Yongzi's heart tightened. His figure split into 9 and shot out in all directions. It was this escape technique that allowed Chun Yongzi to escape from the two disciples of the Holy Land so many times. Without this secret technique, Chun Yongzi would have long fallen under the immortal sword. Chun Yongzi, if this is all you've got, then die obediently. There was a trace of disdain in the eyes of one of the disciples of the Holy Land. In an instant, the sword light that slashed at Chun Yongzi also split into 9. The 9 sword lights were majestic and exuded a monstrous murderous intent as they shrouded Chun Yongzi. It's over. Chun Yongzi's heart was cold. He did not expect that these two disciples of the Holy Land would actually think of a way to restrain his secret technique so quickly. Even if I, Chun Yongzi, die, I will drag you guys down with me. Chun Yongzi's expression was ferocious. However, at this moment, buzz, buzz, buzz. A ripple of nothingness that was as calm as the surface of water suddenly rippled. Right above Chun Yongzi and the two disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land, ripples spread out one after another. Under the ripples, the space was sealed and the sword lights that slashed at Chun Yongzi collapsed directly and turned into nothingness. This is. The two disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land looked up at the sky with deep shock in their eyes. When Chun Yongzi saw this scene, He subconsciously followed the gaze of the two disciples and looked up at the sky. With just one look, Chun Yongzi saw a scene that he would never forget for the rest of his life. In the void that was like the surface of water, there were ripples after ripples. Endless ripples constantly merged and condensed. The space gradually distorted and suddenly, a passage appeared. The passage was deep and unfathomable. Under everyone's incredulous gaze, they saw a towering and magnificent palace slowly squeezing into the passage. Chapter 356. What is that? Chun Yongzi was dumbfounded. He stared blankly at the towering palace that was slowly squeezing into the deep passageway. His mind was completely blank. The feeling this towering palace gave Chun Yongzi was too terrifying. Even the Lord of the Nine Swords Holy Land was as weak as an ant in front of this towering palace. In the entire Nine Swords world, perhaps only the Nine Swords Sacred Mountain in the center could compare to this palace. However, the Nine Swords Sacred Mountain was left behind by the Nine Swords Paragon 50,000 years ago. The Nine Swords Holy Land occupied the Nine Swords Holy Mountain, which was why they could suppress the Nine Swords world. In Chun Yongzi's opinion, there should be nothing in this world that could compare to the Nine Swords Sacred Mountain. But now, Chun Yongzi felt that his views were collapsing. Compared to Chun Yongzi's shock, the other two disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land were terrified. As disciples of the Holy Land, what they had seen and heard naturally far exceeded Chun Yongzi's. They were even more clear about what this towering palace meant. Void passageway? This is a void passageway? One of the Holy Land disciples on the left had an extremely solemn expression. In the ancient books passed down by the Nine Swords Holy Land, there were records of void passageways. The two Holy Land disciples had never thought that they would be able to see it with their own eyes. Could it be that this is a treasure from outside the Nine Swords world? The Holy Land disciple on the right suddenly thought of something and his face suddenly turned fiery. Although the Nine Swords world was only a small world, and it was not as vast as the immortal sect's small world, it was still comparable to the size of dozens of Tang empires. Even if the Nine Swords Holy Land was strong, it could not control all of it. Therefore, rare treasures would often appear, such as the elixir that Chun Yongzi was guarding. But now, in the eyes of the two Holy Land disciples, the void passageway in front of them, as well as the towering palace that slowly squeezed from the void passageway, were some kind of treasure, far more important than the so-called elixir. After all, although the elixir was precious, it was still something born in the Nine Swords world, while the towering palace in front of them was suspected to be a treasure from beyond the heavens. How could the two be compared? This is definitely the most precious treasure in the history of the Nine Swords world, comparable to the Holy Mountain. The other Saint Land disciple said fervently as he stared intently at the palace. 50,000 years ago, the few patriarchs of the Nine Swords Saint Land had occupied the Nine Swords Holy Mountain. That was how the Nine Swords Saint Land came into existence for the next 50,000 years. Although the towering palace in front of them was not comparable to the Nine Swords Holy Mountain, it was not much weaker. If I can control this palace, I'll definitely be able to soar into the sky. I might even be able to break free from the shackles of a Saint Land and create another Saint Land. The Saint Land disciple on the right muttered to himself. Although the Nine Swords Saint Land dominated the Nine Swords world, the Nine Swords world was still a little world with limited resources. Even as disciples of the Nine Swords Saint Land, they still had to fight for it. Otherwise, the two of them would not have pursued Chun Yongzi for so long just for elixir. Although elixirs were precious, they grew in a large area in the Saint Land's herb garden. To the Saint Land, elixirs were nothing. However, to the disciples of the Saint Land, any elixir could help them improve their strength and fight for the Saint Land's nurturing. However, the outer heaven palace in front of them had given the two Saint Land disciples new hope. It was a hope that they could rise without relying on the Saint Land. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint, the two Holy Land disciples' thoughts raced. Of course, they knew that the outer heaven palace might be extremely dangerous, but so what? 50,000 years ago, the few ancestral masters of the Nine Swords Saint Land had also gone through a fierce battle. They only managed to occupy the Nine Swords Sacred Mountain and built the Nine Swords Saint Land after being threatened with death dozens of times. The Saint Land disciple on the left said in a deep voice, "Let's join forces." If we encounter any danger we can't resist, we'll immediately retreat and report this matter to the Saint Land. If they couldn't do it, they would naturally choose to report to the Saint Land. In this way, the Saint Land would definitely reward them for discovering the Outer Heaven Palace. We have to be quick. Otherwise, if we drag it out for too long, when the Saint Land's elders arrive, there will be nothing left for us to do. The Saint Land disciple on the right nodded. The appearance of the void passage had caused space ripples to spread to the entire Nine Swords world. After a while, it would probably alarm the Nine Swords Saint Land. By the time the Nine Swords Saint Land found out that something was wrong and investigated personally, their contribution would obviously be reduced by half. Taking the initiative to report and the Saint Land already knowing about it were two completely different things. After saying that, the two Saint Land disciples carefully flew toward the majestic palace that was squeezed into the Nine Swords world. At this moment, Chun Yongzi, who was not far away, was left behind. Compared to the Outer Heaven Palace in front of him, the spirit herb that Chun Yongzi was guarding was nothing at all. Naturally, the two Saint Land disciples were too lazy to care about Chun Yongzi. Forget it. This is not something I can participate in. It's better to leave first. At least I can protect the spirit herb. Chun Yongzi raised his head and looked at the towering and magnificent palace, and made a decision in his heart. Although he also vaguely realized the value of the palace, it was obvious that the two Saint Land disciples had already beaten him to it. Chun Yongzi did not have any other greedy thoughts. He just wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. Otherwise, when the two Saint Land disciples made time, it would not be so easy for him to leave. With this thought, Chun Yongzi looked at the two Saint Land disciples one last time. At this moment, the two Saint Land disciples were already very close to the majestic palace. They even stepped on the steps of the palace and were ready to enter. However, at this moment Chun Yongzi suddenly opened his eyes wide. Under Chun Yongzi's shocked gaze, he saw a tall and slender figure slowly walking out from the depths of the palace. Dong dong dong. Low footsteps could be heard, as if they were stepping on Chun Yongzi's heartbeat. This. Chun Yongzi looked at the two Saint Land disciples who had already stepped on the steps. At this moment, the eyes of the two Saint Land disciples were horrified. They seemed to have noticed something and wanted to escape, but in the next moment, their bodies began to collapse, and even their essence souls were quickly dispersing. The Nine Swords Holy Land will not let you go. One of the Saint Land disciples left this sentence, and his whole person completely disappeared, as if he had never appeared in this world. This is the Nine Swords world? Su Qin ignored the two Saint Land disciples, and turned to look at the sky. The world's essence qi is so rich. What method does the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords world rely on to maintain the world's essence qi for tens of thousands of years? Whether it was the Nine Swords world created by the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords world, or the Immortal Gate world created by several supreme powerhouses, in a sense it was not strictly a world. It could not form an internal circulation, and naturally produce world's essence qi. Take the world of immortal sex for example. After more than 10,000 years, whether it was the qi of vitality, spiritual opportunity, or the imprint of the Tao of Dharma, they had all dissipated to a certain extent. If the passageway was not opened again, it would naturally deteriorate after a few thousand years. By then, the existence of Earth immortals would probably be extinct. But the Nine Swords world was different. Su Qin could clearly feel the world's essence qi in every inch of space in the Nine Swords world. Just when Su Qin was carefully feeling the Nine Swords world, not far away, Chun Yongzi felt his scalp explode. Especially when Su Qin walked out of the War God's temple. An inexplicable aura enveloped a radius of 100 li. Within this 100 li, let alone running, it was extremely difficult for Chun Yongzi to even move. It's over, it's over. Something big has happened, something big has happened. Chun Yongzi was sweating profusely, and his heart was trembling uneasily. Even if he didn't know what Su Qin's origin was, the two disciples of the Nine Swords Holy Land really died in Su Qin's hands. In this way, once the Nine Swords Holy Land finds out, it will be a great disaster. After all, the Nine Swords Holy Land has always been overbearing. When the Holy Land learns that their disciples died in the hands of others, how can they easily let it go? The two disciples of the Holy Land wanted to take away the spirit medicine that Chun Yongzi had been guarding for 80 years. The reason why Chun Yongzi would rather flee for hundreds of thousands of li than resist was because he didn't dare. In the Nine Swords world, the words Nine Swords Holy Land were too heavy. Even in the end, Chun Yongzi knew that he had no way out, which was why he had the thought of perishing together with his enemy. Of course, no matter how furious the Nine Swords Holy Land was, all of this had nothing to do with Chun Yongzi. After all, Chun Yongzi didn't know Su Qin. But when the gods fight, the mortals suffer. Even if Chun Yongzi wanted to retreat, how could he avoid the Nine Swords Holy Land's aftermath? Just when Chun Yongzi was standing there in a daze, Su Qin's eyes turned slightly and looked at the pale Chun Yongzi. "Come here." Su Qin beckoned towards Chun Yongzi. "Wang." Chun Yongzi only felt his vision go black. When he recovered his vision again, he had already appeared in front of Su Qin. "Junior." Junior Chun Yongzi greets Senior. Chun Yongzi was startled, and immediately bowed deeply towards Su Qin, and said respectfully. Chun Yongzi didn't know Su Qin's name, but in Chun Yongzi's heart, Su Qin was at least an elder of the Nine Swords Holy Land. "Chun Yongzi." Su Qin glanced at Chun Yongzi. With Su Qin's eyesight, he could naturally see that Chun Yongzi was just a sixth heavenly layer legend. The two Holy Land disciples who tried to approach the War God Temple just now were also around this realm. Who is the strongest person in this world? Su Qin thought for a while and asked bluntly. Although through the eyes of truth and celestial eyes, Su Qin already knew that in the Nine Swords world, the strongest person was only at the peak of the origin realm, that was all. As for the specific situation of the Nine Swords world, which force dominates it, and whether there are any means left by the supreme powerhouse of the Nine Swords world, it was unknown. After all, whether it was the eyes of truth or the celestial eyes, they could only see all kinds of qi in the world. It was not like the Buddhist divine ability, heavenly eye, which could see the entire 3 realms and 6 paths. Of course, this was not to say that the eyes of truth was inferior to the heavenly eye, but the focus of the two was different and could not be compared. The strongest person? Chun Yongzi was slightly taken aback, and did not react. In the Nine Swords world, as long as one entered the martial Tao, who doesn't know that the Nine Swords Holy Land is the absolute ruler? The strongest person in the world can only come from the Nine Swords Holy Land. It's just that. Chun Yongzi suddenly thought of Su Qin's question just now. Being able to say the words "this world" meant that Su Qin was probably not from the Nine Swords world. Otherwise, how could he call it in such a transcendent tone? The fact that he was able to say the words "this world" meant that Su Qin was most likely not a being from the Nine Swords world. Otherwise, how could he address it in such an aloof tone? Thinking of this, Chun Yongzi, who had just calmed down, was once again shaken. An existence outside this world. Although Chun Yongzi was not able to browse through the books of the Holy Land like the disciples of the Holy Land, he knew what it meant. An existence outside the world. Although Chun Yongzi could not browse the Holy Land's ancient books like the Holy Land's disciples, he also knew what it meant. Su Qin saw that Chun Yongzi did not speak, and frowned slightly. The reason why he left Chun Yongzi alive was because he wanted to inquire about the Nine Swords world through him. The Nine Swords world was a world created by the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse, and the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse was ranked in the top 3 among all the powerhouses that Su Qin had come into contact with. He was second only to the white-clothed, white-haired Supreme Powerhouse who left behind the 3,000 Fantasy Islands, and the first master of the War God Temple, Ho Yuan. Senior. The strongest person in the world today should be the Holy Lord of the Nine Swords Holy Land. Chun Yongzi seemed to notice Su Qin's dissatisfaction. Cold sweat quickly appeared on his forehead, and he immediately replied, "Nine Swords Holy Land." Su Qin repeated in a low voice and then asked, "The inheritance left by the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse?" Su Qin's expression became solemn. If the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse really left an inheritance in the Nine Swords world, then Su Qin had to be careful. Although Su Qin confirmed with the eyes of truth that the strongest being in the Nine Swords world was only at the origin returning realm, this does not include the trump cards of the Supreme Powerhouse. In case the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse left many trump cards in the Nine Swords Holy Land in order to preserve the inheritance, Su Qin may suffer a big loss. Although in the past tens of thousands of years, Even the trump cards left by the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse were not as powerful. After all, he was still a void-shattering realm powerhouse. The inheritance left by the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse? Chun Yangzi quickly shook his head and said, Senior, the Nine Swords Holy Land only occupies the Holy Mountain where the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse once went into seclusion. It is not the inheritance left by the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse, although the Nine Swords Holy Land once wanted to completely cover up this matter and claimed to be the orthodox inheritance of the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse. In fact, even the Nine Swords Holy Land has never been able to enter the peak of the Holy Mountain. In this way, no matter how the Nine Swords Holy Land tries to cover it up, it will just be a joke. If the Nine Swords Holy Land is really the Holy Land of the Nine Swords Supreme Powerhouse, how can it not even be able to reach the peak of the Holy Mountain? So that's how it is. Su Qin slightly nodded. At the same time, just when Su Qin entered the Nine Swords world on the War God Temple, in the center of the world on a holy mountain that was thousands of zhang high, somewhere near the mountainside in a majestic hall, a tall figure sitting cross-legged suddenly opened his eyes. He looked at the constantly trembling divine sword in front of him in shock. The divine sword has a spirit. Is this the aura outside the Nine Swords world? Chapter 357. Let's take a look before entering the Nine Swords world. Su Qin carefully looked at the void passage, then opened the Eye of Truth and used the celestial divination technique to look at the end of the void passage. Previously, Su Qin used the Eye of Truth to observe the Nine Swords world, but because the void passage had yet to form, he could only roughly know the information of the Nine Swords world itself, which was the information left behind by the Nine Swords Paragon. As for the specific information of the Nine Swords world, he was not clear. But it was different now. Now that the void passage had completely stabilized, if Su Qin used the Eye of Truth to observe, he would naturally get more information than last time. This was like looking at the same thing from 10,000 meters away and 100 meters away. The latter would definitely be clearer than the former. A world emitting green light appeared, and at the same time all kinds of qi gushed out. There are living creatures in the Nine Swords world? Su Qin's heart skipped a beat. The qi that he observed with the Eye of Truth could only be emitted by living creatures, which meant that there were a large number of living creatures in the Nine Swords world. Not only that, Su Qin also found that the living creatures in the Nine Swords world were not weak, and the strongest had reached the peak of the true realm. Interesting. A smile appeared on Su Qin's face. If there were living creatures in the Divine Ruins realm in the Nine Swords world, Su Qin might consider whether to enter or not, but the true realm, even if it was at the peak of the true realm, how could it compare to Su Qin? Next, Su Qin looked carefully a few more times, and after confirming the approximate level of the Nine Swords world, he summoned the Battle Temple. A majestic palace appeared in front of Su Qin, and under the fluctuation of the palace's aura, even the void passage began to solidify. There were only two ways to pass through the void tunnel. One was to reach the realm of an omnipotent and master the power of space. Passing through the void tunnel would be a piece of cake. The other was to rely on treasures that contained the power of space to resist the spatial fragments during the process of passing through. For example, when Taiyin Fairy and the others came to the mortal realm, they used the Taiyin token to pass through the void passage, while Wan Yuan Daoist and the others used the pagoda-shaped defensive treasure to pass through. Other than that, there was no other way. Even the direct descendants of those supreme powerhouses who had awakened their bloodlines could not pass through the void passage on their own. The power of space was unbreakable for those below the level of utmost powerful beings. This was an iron law. Of course, other living beings would not be able to break this iron law. Su Qin, on the other hand, had dozens of methods that could allow him to pass through the void passageway while being below the level of an ultimate expert. For example, if one cultivated the picture of the great sun to great completion, one could transform into the three-legged golden crow, the most powerful divine beast of the fire element. Although the three-legged golden crow was not the most powerful mythical beast of space, its body was extremely strong. Even if it was just a baby, it was not something that space fragments could do to it. Also, Su Qin had cultivated his war god domain to the extreme and created a world, which allowed him to easily pass through the void passageway. Or Su Qin could use the second move of the Buddha's palm, the Pure Land in the palm, to seal himself and then use the power of the seal to pass through the void passageway and so on. Su Qin had chosen the simplest method, which was to take the War God Temple and pass through the void passageway. The War God Temple was a super large spatial treasure. Its value was even higher than the life treasure of an ultimate expert. Taking the War God Temple to pass through the void passageway was an insult to the War God Temple. Su Qin took a step forward and entered the War God Temple. Then the entire War God Temple turned into a stream of light and entered the void passageway. Is this the void? An area outside the mortal realm? Su Qin stood in the War God Temple, but images appeared in front of him. This was a vast space. Even the majestic War God Temple was like a speck of dust in this space. Extremely far away, there were faint specks of light. Apart from these specks of light, there was nothing else in this vast space. No wonder a small number of ultimate experts didn't choose to leave the mortal realm and head to the outer realm. So this is what the void is like. Su Qin was slightly shocked. Even though there was a War God Temple between them, Su Qin could still feel the endless loneliness and coldness. Although ultimate experts could survive in the void, compared to the colorful world of the mortal realm, the void was not even a desert. If they lived in such an environment for hundreds or thousands of years, even ultimate experts would probably go crazy. However, according to the ancient records, the distance in the void is different from the distance in the mortal realm. If ultimate experts want to go to a place, they only need to break through space and enter the void. Then they can take a few steps in this direction. When they return to the mortal realm, they have already traveled tens or hundreds of thousands of miles. Su Qin thought to himself. In the void there was no up, down, left and right. Similarly, in terms of distance there was a huge difference from the mortal realm. However, my goal this time isn't the depths of the void, but there? Su Qin turned his gaze and looked in the direction of the void passage. He saw a faint green spot of light flickering slowly. It was the Nine Swords world that the void passage was connected to. Speed up. Su Qin immediately controlled the War God Temple and headed toward the Nine Swords world. At the same time, Nine Swords world, there were 3 streaks of light, 1 in front and 2 behind. The streak of light in front was fleeing frantically, while the 2 streaks of light behind were chasing after it. Why? The fleeing streak of light realized that it could not escape, so it suddenly stopped and stared at the 2 streaks of light that were chasing after it. Your 9 Swords sacred ground has cut off the world's fate for 50,000 years. You are already invincible in the world. Why don't you give us a way out? After this pause, the figure of an extremely wretched old man appeared. The Nine Swords world was created by the Nine Swords Paragon. 50,000 years ago, the Nine Swords Paragon did not leave immediately after he created the Nine Swords world. Instead, he cultivated in seclusion in this world for hundreds of years. During those hundreds of years, the Nine Swords Paragon felt that this world was lonely, so he used his ability to move some of the living beings in the mortal realm to the Nine Swords world. After the Nine Swords Paragon left, some of these living beings used a move that the Nine Swords Paragon left behind to occupy the Nine Swords Paragon's place of seclusion. They also grasped some of the moves that the Nine Swords Paragon left behind. They were known as the Nine Swords Sacred Ground, overlooking the entire Nine Swords world. However, although the Nine Swords Sacred Ground was high and mighty, they were not the only people in this world. There were still rogue cultivators outside the Sacred Ground. Rogue cultivators were either unwilling to join the Sacred Ground, or could not meet the requirements to join the Sacred Ground. They could only live independently outside the Sacred Ground. As a result, the disciples of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground did not treat rogue cultivators as humans. Under the suppression of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground, ordinary rogue cultivators had no chance of resisting. Daoist Chun Yangzi. The 2 streaks of light also stopped and looked indifferently at the miserable-looking old man. Hand over the spirit herb and become my sacred ground slave for 200 years, and we'll let you live. To these 2 disciples of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground, making Daoist Chun Yangzi a slave was already a great gift. Hand over the spirit herb? Become a slave for 200 years? Daoist Chun Yangzi was stunned for a moment before he laughed crazily. You're forcing Lao Dao to die. The spirit herb was discovered by Lao Dao first. It has nothing to do with your Nine Swords Sacred Ground. Natural treasures belong to those who are virtuous. What right do you have to demand Lao Dao to hand it over? Daoist Chunyangzi questioned word by word. This spirit herb was discovered 80 years ago by Daoist Chunyangzi. At that time, the spirit herb had yet to mature. In order to wait for it to mature, Daoist Chunyangzi had to wait for 80 years, expending a great deal of effort during this period. Finally, after 80 years, the spirit herb had matured. However, just as Daoist Chunyangzi's face was filled with joy, news of it leaked out and he encountered 2 disciples of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground who happened to pass by. These 2 disciples demanded that Daoist Chunyangzi hand over the spirit herb. Of course, Daoist Chunyangzi wasn't willing. He had already spent 80 years and his lifespan was already running out. He was waiting for this spirit herb to break through and extend his lifespan, so how could he possibly hand it over? Even if the other party was a high and mighty disciple of a sacred ground. Natural treasures belong to those who are virtuous? The 2 disciples of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground sneered. Daoist Chunyangzi, didn't your master tell you that in this world, our Nine Swords Sacred Ground is virtuous? If it weren't for your merit in cultivating this spirit herb, you wouldn't even have the chance to become a slave of our sacred ground. But now, since you've refused, you can die. The 2 disciples of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground's expression turned cold. Suddenly, a dense sword light appeared and slashed at Daoist Chunyangzi. Not good. Daoist Chunyangzi's heart tightened. His figure split into 9 and shot out in all directions. It was because of this secret escape technique that Daoist Chunyangzi was able to escape from the 2 disciples of the sacred ground so many times. Without this secret technique, Daoist Chunyangzi would have died under the immortal sword long ago. Daoist Chunyangzi, if this is all you've got, then obediently die. A trace of disdain flashed in the eyes of one of the disciples. In an instant, the sword light slashing at Daoist Chunyangzi also split into 9. The 9 sword lights were majestic and exuded monstrous killing intent as they enveloped Daoist Chunyangzi. It's over. Daoist Chunyangzi's heart turned cold. He didn't expect that these 2 disciples of the sacred ground would come up with a method to restrain his secret technique so quickly. Even if I, Daoist Chunyangzi, die, I'll drag you down with me. Daoist Chunyangzi's face turned sinister. However, at this moment Wang. A ripple of nothingness suddenly spread out like a calm water surface. One ripple after another appeared above Daoist Chunyangzi and the 2 disciples of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground. Under the ripple, space was sealed, and the sword light slashing at Daoist Chunyangzi collapsed and turned into nothingness. This is? The 2 disciples of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground looked up at the sky with great shock in their eyes. When Daoist Chunyangzi saw this, he subconsciously followed the gaze of the 2 disciples and looked up at the sky. With just a glance, Daoist Chunyangzi saw a scene that he would never forget for the rest of his life. One ripple after another appeared in the sky that was like a calm water surface. The endless ripples continued to fuse and condense. Space gradually distorted, and suddenly a passage appeared. The passage was deep and unfathomable. Under everyone's incredulous gazes, a majestic palace slowly squeezed through the passage. Chapter 358. Nine Swords Sacred Mountain, the Divine Sword, which had been constantly releasing layers of light screens and reflecting the scenes from hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, suddenly began to shake violently. Then countless images rapidly collapsed. In that instant, everyone was dead silent. From Sacred Lord Nine Sword to the Grand Elders of the Sacred Lands, everyone was dumbfounded and in disbelief. This divine sword was passed down by the supreme expert of the Nine Swords Sacred Land, Nine Li. The reason why the Nine Swords Sacred Land was able to dominate the world, and even started to refine the outer perimeter of the sacred mountain, was because of this divine sword. The divine sword had a spirit, and it could instantly see every corner of the nine-sword world with the help of the sacred mountain. Of course, doing this would consume a lot of Sacred Lord Nine Swords energy, but now that the aura of the outer world had appeared, Sacred Lord Nine Sword didn't care about this anymore. However, what no one present expected was that just as the divine sword was about to reveal its true form, it actually collapsed inexplicably. How was this possible? The Grand Elders of the Holy Lands were puzzled. However, Sacred Lord Nine Swords' expression was solemn, and he seemed to have guessed something. It's an Essence Soul secret technique. This person used an Essence Soul secret technique to stop the Divine Sword from seeing him. Sacred Lord Nine Sword paused for a moment before continuing. If it wasn't for the fact that the Divine Sword stopped moving on its own, we would have been in big trouble. As soon as he said this, the expressions of the other Grand Elders of the Sacred Lands turned pale again. Sacred Lord Nine Sword was right. If it wasn't for the images suddenly crumbling, their minds would have sunk into the pair of deep eyes. How could they still be talking here? This is too terrifying. Is this the Essence Soul secret technique that the Supreme Powerhouse of the Nine Swords mentioned? The Grand Elder's eyebrows were covered in cold sweat. Compared to domains, magic power, and other means, Essence Soul secret technique is invisible and intangible. It's impossible to guard against. Even with a medium, it can kill people from thousands of miles away. Although Su Qin's gaze was not so exaggerated, it was obvious that even Sacred Lord Nine Sword was afraid, let alone the other Grand Elders. However, through this matter, it should have been confirmed that this person is just an Earth Immortal. At most, he is a bit special, an Earth Immortal of the Essence Soul lineage. The second Grand Elder said slowly, if the person was really a powerhouse, he should have torn the void and arrived at the Nine Swords Holy Mountain the moment he was seen. Indeed, although an Earth Immortal of the Essence Soul lineage is terrifying, it is not impossible to resist. Another Grand Elder said, if he didn't know in advance and rashly encountered an Earth Immortal of the Essence Soul lineage, even Sacred Lord Nine Sword would suffer a big loss. But now that he knows that the other party is a powerhouse of the Essence Soul lineage, he should be much calmer after making preparations. Although Essence Soul secret techniques are known as strange and unpredictable, they are not invincible. There are even some Essence Soul killer moves that completely kill 1,000 enemies but damage oneself 800. For example, Su Qin obtained the Essence Soul killer move, Heart Sword technique, on the Myriad Sword Island. It turns the power of Essence Soul into a Heart Sword, and then controls the Heart Sword to kill the enemy. If he can successfully kill the other party's Essence Soul, then everything will be fine. But if he fails and the Heart Sword itself is damaged, then it will also backfire on Su Qin's Essence Soul. At best, his Essence Soul will be weakened, and at worst it will collapse. Of course, the Essence Soul killer move, Abyss of Darkness, does not have this hidden danger. Abyss of Darkness does not condense his power of Essence Soul into a certain item, but instead forms an illusory world in his sea of consciousness, and then uses this illusory world to attract the minds of others. As a divine skill of the Essence Soul lineage, even if it fails, it will have no effect on Su Qin. The Holy Mountain was left by a powerhouse. Once we hide in a high place, no matter how powerful the Essence Soul secret technique is, it should be useless against us. Sacred Lord Nine Sword nodded slightly. The sacred mountain under their feet, which was thousands of meters tall, was refined by the supreme expert of the Nine Swords, Zhou Li 50,000 years ago at a great cost. Even if it couldn't compare to the 9 divine swords on Zhou Li's back, it was still slightly stronger than an ordinary natal supreme treasure. Although it can't completely block the Essence Soul killer move, it can at least weaken the power of the Essence Soul killer move by 99%. What should we do now? The void passage is over there, should we go? Another Supreme Elder said in a deep voice. The people present were all Earth Immortals at the Origin Realm. The temptation of the void passage was too great for them. It was equivalent to the hope of advancing further. No hurry. The Supreme Powerhouse of the Nine Swords did not leave behind any Essence Soul Supreme treasures. If we go out recklessly, do any of you have the confidence to block his Essence Soul secret skill? Sacred Lord Nine Swords glanced at the few Supreme Elders and said calmly. When the few Supreme Elders heard this, their expressions changed. Even if they knew that the opponent was good at Essence Soul secret skill, so what? There were only 2 ways to block the Essence Soul secret skill. One was to rely on the protection of the Supreme Treasure, and the other was to resist it. If they resisted, they would live. If they couldn't, they would die. The few Supreme Elders present did not have the confidence to block the pair of eyes that were as deep as the world. As for the Supreme Treasure, the entire Nine Swords sacred ground did not have many of them. If they lost one, they would have one less. How could they let a Supreme Elder bring the Supreme Treasure out? Then what should we do? The Supreme Elder with the white eyebrows said unwillingly. The other Supreme Elders also frowned slightly. Clearly, they were unwillingly as well. If the void tunnel had never appeared, they would not have any other emotions. After all, countless geniuses from sacred grounds and sects had died in the origin-returning realm over the past 50,000 years. But now that the void tunnel had appeared in front of them, who could resist the temptation? Don't worry. This person will probably take the initiative to find the Nine Swords sacred ground. When that time comes, we will use the power of the sacred mountain to meet this essence soul expert from the outer realm. Sacred Lord Nine Swords' eyes flashed as he spoke. The Nine Swords sacred mountain was the absolute core of the entire Nine Swords world, and it even had the inheritance of a powerhouse. Sacred Lord Nine Swords did not believe that the other party would not be interested in it. Outside the void tunnel, Su Qin was listening to Chun Yongzi's words when he suddenly raised his head slightly and glanced in a certain direction. Interesting. A smile appeared on Su Qin's face. With his strength, he had naturally sensed the feeling of being watched at the first moment. Compared with the mighty observation of the demon god's eye in the gate of immortality, this feeling of being watched was extremely weak. It was precisely because of this that Su Qin directly followed the feeling of being watched, and returned it with the Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness. Compared with other Essence Soul Killer moves, the Abyss of Darkness was even weirder. It could simply kill with one's gaze. It's a pity. In the end, it was blocked by other forces. Su Qin shook his head slightly and thought silently in his heart. In fact, Su Qin was not disappointed. Although the Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, was powerful, it was obviously impossible to kill several powerhouses of the same level from hundreds of thousands of li away. In Su Qin's opinion, even if there was no other force blocking it, the Abyss of Darkness would not be able to do anything to the other party. At most, it would make the other party's mind sink for a moment. "Senior, what happened?" Chun Yongzi, who was next to him, saw an inexplicable smile on Su Qin's face. He immediately braced himself and asked uneasily. "It's nothing." Su Qin shook his head and said casually, "Come with me to the holy mountain." Chapter 359. What is that? Taoist Pure Sun was dumbfounded. He stared blankly at the majestic palace that was slowly squeezing through the passage, his mind completely blank. This majestic palace gave Taoist Pure Sun a terrifying feeling. Even the master of the Nine-Sword Holy Land was as weak as an ant in front of this majestic palace. In the entire Nine-Sword world, perhaps only the Nine-Sword Sacred Mountain at the center could compare to this palace. However, the Nine-Sword Sacred Mountain was left behind by a supreme powerhouse from 50,000 years ago. It was precisely because the Nine-Sword Holy Land occupied the Nine-Sword Sacred Mountain that they were able to dominate the Nine-Sword world. In Taoist Pure Sun's view, there shouldn't be anything in the world that could compare to the Nine-Sword Sacred Mountain. But now, Taoist Pure Sun felt that his view was collapsing. In contrast to Taoist Pure Sun's shock, the other two disciples of the Nine-Sword Holy Land were terrified. As disciples of the Holy Land, their knowledge and experience far exceeded Taoist Pure Sun's. They were even more aware of what this majestic palace meant. A void passage? This is a void passage? The disciple on the left had an extremely solemn expression. The ancient books passed down in the Nine-Sword Holy Land had records of void passages. These two disciples had never thought that they would be able to see something like this with their own eyes. Could this be a great treasure that came from outside the Nine-Sword world? The disciple on the right suddenly thought of something and a trace of excitement appeared on his face. Although the Nine-Sword world was only a small world and wasn't as vast as the small worlds of immortal sects, it was still comparable to dozens of times the size of the Empire of Tang. Even the powerful Nine-Sword Holy Land couldn't control all of it. Therefore, strange treasures would appear from time to time, such as the spirit herb that Taoist Pure Sun was guarding. In the eyes of the two Saint Land's disciples, the void tunnel before their eyes and the majestic palace that was slowly squeezing out of the void tunnel were precious treasures. Moreover, they were far more important than the so-called spirit medicine. After all, while the spirit herb was precious, it was something that was born in the Nine-Sword world. On the other hand, the majestic palace in front of them was suspected to be a great treasure from beyond the heavens. How could the two be compared? This is definitely the most precious treasure in the history of our nine-sword world. It's comparable to the sacred mountain. Another Holy Land disciple calmed himself down and stared intently at the palace, his voice burning with passion. 50,000 years ago, the ancestors of the nine-sword holy ground had occupied the nine-sword sacred mountain. That was how the nine-sword holy ground came to dominate the world for the next 50,000 years. Now, the majestic palace in front of him was not much weaker than the nine-sword sacred mountain. If I can take control of this palace, I'll definitely be able to soar into the sky. I might even be able to break free from the shackles of the Holy Land and establish another Holy Land. The disciple on the right muttered to himself. Although the nine-sword Holy Land suppressed the nine-sword world, the nine-sword world was still a minor world with limited resources. Even the disciples of the nine-sword Holy Land had to fight for it. Otherwise, the two of them wouldn't have chased Taoist pure sun for such a long time over a single spirit herb. One had to know that although spiritual herbs were precious, there were a large number of them growing in the Holy Land's herb garden. To the Holy Land, spiritual herbs were nothing. However, for the disciples of the Holy Land, any stock of spiritual medicine had the potential to increase their strength by another level, allowing them to be nurtured by the Holy Land. But now, this extraterrestrial palace in front of them had given the two disciples a new hope. A hope that they could rise without relying on the Holy Land. In a flash, the two disciples' thoughts spun rapidly. They naturally knew that this extraterrestrial palace might contain great risks, but so what? 50,000 years ago, the ancestors of the nine-sword Holy Land had also gone through fierce battles and dozens of life-threatening situations before occupying the nine-sword sacred mountain and establishing the nine-sword Holy Land. The two of us will work together. If we encounter any danger that we can't resist, we'll immediately retreat and report this matter to the Holy Land, the disciple on the left said in a deep voice. If things didn't work out, they would naturally choose to report it to the Holy Land. This way, the Holy Land would definitely reward them for discovering this extraterrestrial palace. Be quick. Otherwise, if we delay too long and the elders of the Holy Land arrive, we won't have anything to do. The disciple on the right nodded. The spatial ripples caused by the appearance of the void passage had probably already spread throughout the nine-sword world. After a while, the nine-sword Holy Land would be alerted. By the time the nine-sword Holy Land discovered that something was wrong and personally investigated, their contribution would be reduced by more than half. Taking the initiative to report and the Holy Land knowing about it were two completely different matters. After saying this, the two disciples cautiously flew toward the majestic palace that squeezed into the nine-sword world. At this time, not far away, Taoist pure sun was left to the side. Compared to the extraterrestrial palace in front of them, the spirit herb Taoist pure sun was guarding was nothing. The two disciples naturally couldn't be bothered with Taoist pure sun. Forget it. This matter is not something I can participate in. It's better to leave first. At least we'll be able to protect that spirit herb. Taoist pure sun raised his head to look at the majestic palace and made a decision in his heart. Although he vaguely realized the value of this palace, it was obvious that the two disciples had already arrived before him. Taoist pure sun no longer had any greed. He only wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. Otherwise, when the two disciples were free, it wouldn't be so easy to leave. With this thought, Taoist pure sun finally glanced at the two disciples. At this time, the two disciples were extremely close to the majestic palace and had even stepped on the steps of the palace, preparing to enter. However, at this time, Taoist pure sun's eyes suddenly widened. Under Taoist pure sun's shocked gaze, a slender and tall figure slowly walked out from the depths of the palace. Dong dong dong. Heavy footsteps sounded, as if they were stepping on Taoist pure sun's heartbeat. This? Taoist pure sun looked at the two disciples who had already stepped on the steps. At this time, the two disciples' eyes were filled with fear. They seemed to have sensed something and wanted to escape, but in the next moment, their bodies began to collapse, and even their yuan spirits were rapidly dispersing. The nine-sword Holy Land won't let you go. One of the disciples left these words before his entire body completely disappeared, as if he had never appeared in this world. This is the nine-sword world? Su Qin ignored the two disciples and turned to look at the sky. The yuan qi and spiritual vigor are so dense. What method did the nine-sword paragon use to maintain the yuan qi and spiritual vigor of this small world without dissipating for tens of thousands of years? Whether it was the nine-sword world created by the nine-sword paragon, or the immortal gate world created by several paragon masters, they weren't strictly considered worlds in a certain sense. They couldn't form an internal cycle and naturally produce yuan qi and spiritual vigor. Take the world of immortals for example. After more than 10,000 years, the vital qi, spiritual vigor, and the imprints of the great Tao had all dissipated to a certain extent. If the passageway was not opened again, it would naturally degrade in a few thousand years. By then, the existence of Earth immortals would probably be extinct. But the nine-sword world was different. Su Qin could clearly sense the yuan qi and spiritual vigor that permeated every inch of the space in the nine-sword world. Just as Su Qin was carefully sensing the nine-sword world. Not far away, Taoist Pure Sun felt his scalp tingle, especially when Su Qin walked out of the war god temple. An inexplicable aura enveloped a radius of 100 li, making it extremely difficult for Taoist Pure Sun to even move an inch, let alone run. It's over, it's over. Something big has happened, something big has happened. Taoist Pure Sun was drenched in cold sweat, his heart trembling uneasily. Even if he didn't know Su Qin's background, 2 disciples of the Nine-Sword Holy Land had indeed fallen in Su Qin's hands. If the Nine-Sword Holy Land were to find out about this, it would be a great disaster. One must know that the Nine-Sword Holy Land had always been domineering. How could the Holy Land let the matter rest after learning that their disciples had fallen in the hands of others? 2 disciples of the Holy Land wanted to take away the elixir that Taoist Pure Sun had guarded for 80 years. The reason why Taoist Pure Sun would rather flee for hundreds of thousands of li than resist was because he didn't dare. In the Nine-Sword world, the words Nine-Sword Holy Land carried too much weight. Even in the end, Taoist Pure Sun knew that he had no way out, which was why he had decided to take them down with him. Of course, no matter how furious the Nine-Sword Holy Land was, it had nothing to do with Taoist Pure Sun. After all, he didn't know Su Qin. But when immortals fought, mortals would suffer. Even if Taoist Pure Sun wanted to escape unscathed, how could he avoid the Nine-Sword Holy Land's revenge? While Taoist Pure Sun stood there in a daze, Su Qin's gaze turned slightly to the pale-faced Taoist Pure Sun. Come here. Su Qin beckoned to Taoist Pure Sun. Buzz. Taoist Pure Sun only felt his vision darken, and when he recovered, he was already in front of Su Qin. Junior Taoist Pure Sun greets Senior. Taoist Pure Sun was shocked and immediately bowed deeply to Su Qin. Taoist Pure Sun didn't know Su Qin's name, but in his mind Su Qin was at least an elder of the Nine-Sword Holy Land. A lofty existence that looked down on all living beings. Taoist Pure Sun? Su Qin glanced at Taoist Pure Sun. With Su Qin's eyesight, he could naturally tell that Taoist Pure Sun was only a 6th heavenly layer legend. The 2 disciples who tried to approach the War God Temple were also at the same level. Who is the strongest expert in this world? Su Qin asked bluntly after some thought. Although Su Qin already knew through the Eye of Truth and the Celestial Seer art that the strongest person in the Nine-Sword world was only at the peak of the Origin realm, that was all. As for the specific situation of the Nine-Sword world, which force ruled it, and whether there were any methods left behind by the strongest expert of the Nine-Sword world, he didn't know. After all, whether it was the Eye of Truth or the Celestial Seer art, they could only see the myriad of auras in the world, unlike the Buddha's heavenly eye that could see the entire world. Of course, this didn't mean that the Eye of Truth was inferior to the heavenly eye, but the focus of the 2 was different and couldn't be compared. The strongest expert? Taoist Pure Sun was slightly stunned and didn't react. In the Nine-Sword world, who didn't know that the Nine-Sword Holy Land was the absolute ruler? The strongest expert in the world could only come from the Nine-Sword Holy Land. However, then Taoist Pure Sun suddenly remembered that Su Qin had called the Nine-Sword world, this world in his question just now. Being able to say this world meant that Su Qin was very likely not a living being of the Nine-Sword world. Otherwise, why would he use such a transcendent tone to call it this world? At the thought of this, Taoist Pure Sun, who had just calmed down, was shaken again. An existence outside the world. Although Taoist Pure Sun couldn't read the scriptures of the Holy Land like the disciples of the Holy Land, he knew what it meant. According to legend, the nine-sword paragon, the creator of the nine-sword world, came from outside the world. Su Qin frowned slightly when Taoist Pure Sun didn't speak. The reason he spared Taoist Pure Sun's life was because he wanted to find out more information about the nine-sword world through him. The nine-sword world was a world created by the nine-sword paragon, who was ranked in the top 3 of all the paragon that Su Qin had come into contact with. He was second only to the white-robed, white-haired paragon of the nascent spirit lineage, who had left behind the 3,000 illusory islands and the first master of the war god temple, Ho Yuan. Senior. Taoist Pure Sun seemed to have sensed Su Qin's dissatisfaction, and cold sweat appeared on his forehead as he immediately replied, "The strongest expert in the world right now should be the Nine-Sword Holy Land's lord." Nine-Sword Holy Land? Su Qin repeated in a low voice, then asked, "The legacy left behind by the Nine-Sword Paragon?" Su Qin's expression turned solemn. If the Nine-Sword Paragon had truly left behind a legacy in the Nine-Sword world, then Su Qin would have to be very careful. Although Su Qin had confirmed with the Eye of Truth that the strongest being in the Nine-Sword world was only at the origin returning realm, this didn't include the Paragon's trump cards. If the Nine-Sword Paragon left behind many trump cards in the Nine-Sword Holy Land in order to preserve his legacy, Su Qin might suffer a great loss. Although tens of thousands of years had passed and even the power left by the Nine-Sword supremacy was almost gone, he was still a supremacy in the void-breaking realm. The legacy left behind by the Nine-Sword Paragon? Taoist Pure Sun hurriedly shook his head and said, "Senior, the Nine-Sword Holy Land only occupied the sacred mountain where the Nine-Sword Paragon had once secluded himself. It's not the legacy left behind by the Nine-Sword Paragon." Although the Nine-Sword Holy Land had once wanted to completely cover up this matter and claimed to be the orthodox legacy of the Nine-Sword Paragon, the truth was that even the Nine-Sword Holy Land had never been able to reach the peak of the sacred mountain. As such, no matter how the Nine-Sword Holy Land tried to cover it up, it would only be a joke. If the Nine-Sword Holy Land was really the Nine-Sword Paragon's legacy, how could they not even reach the peak of the sacred mountain? "I see." Su Qin nodded slightly. Meanwhile, just as Su Qin was riding the war god temple into the Nine-Sword world, at the center of the world, on a sacred mountain that was several thousand feet tall, somewhere near the peak of the mountain in a majestic hall, a tall figure sitting cross-legged suddenly opened his eyes and looked at the trembling divine sword in front of him in shock. The divine sword has a spirit. This is the aura outside the Nine-Sword world? Chapter 360. World. Aura from outside the world? The tall figure sitting cross-legged muttered to himself in a low voice. His eyes were filled with bewilderment, as if he had sensed something extremely inconceivable. "Sacred Lord, what did you discover?" Below the tall figure, several Nine-Sword Sacred Grounds Grand Elders narrowed their eyes and asked immediately. Although the Nine-Sword world was a small world created by the Nine-Sword Paragon, Jolie, when Jolie went to the void outside, he didn't leave behind a way to leave the Nine-Sword world. Hence, the living beings in the Nine-Sword world had been trapped in the Nine-Sword world for tens of thousands of years. To ordinary living beings, even those pinnacle legends, the Nine-Sword world wasn't much different from the mortal realm. Due to the small world, the Nine-Sword world wouldn't have a vitality tide. However, in the eyes of a true Earth immortal, the Nine-Sword world was no different from a cage. It was unknown what method the Nine-Swords Paragon expert, Jolie, had used to maintain the vitality spiritual vigor in the Nine-Swords world in an abundant state. However, the vitality spiritual vigor alone was far from enough for the land immortals to cultivate. The land immortals needed more comprehension of the great Tao of heaven and earth, especially when the land immortals of the true realm were entering the divine ruins realm. The Nine-Sword world was just a small world created by a paragon. It wasn't a true large world like the mortal realm. Hence, it naturally didn't have any great Tao of heaven and earth. Hence, even if they had countless resources in the Nine-Sword world and even started to touch on the inheritance left behind by the Nine-Sword Paragon Jolie, due to the limitations of the world, the strongest person in the Nine-Sword Sacred Ground was only a true realm earth immortal. It had been like this for tens of thousands of years and had never changed. Hence, all the earth immortals in the Nine-Sword Sacred Ground wanted to leave the Nine-Sword world and head to the legendary large world in the mortal realm. Although the vitality tide would fluctuate in the mortal realm, At least it wouldn't be as hopeless as the Nine-Sword World. When the Nine-Sword Paragon Zhou Li led countless living beings into the Nine-Sword World 50,000 years ago, he never thought of letting them leave. In the eyes of the Nine-Sword Paragon, these living beings were just some random actions he did when he was lonely. It was fine for them to fend for themselves. Through the divine sword, I sensed an outer aura. The Nine-Sword Saint Master had a tall figure. He stared at the trembling divine sword in front of him and spoke in a deep voice. 50,000 years ago, the reason why the Nine-Sword Holy Ground's ancestors occupied the outer perimeter of the Holy Mountain and established the Nine-Sword Holy Ground was because of this divine sword. Through this divine sword, the successive holy masters of the Nine-Sword Holy Land could faintly radiate their perception to the entire Nine-Sword world. Although they couldn't see everything, they could still clearly sense auras that were different from the world itself. Outer World Aura. The several Nine-Sword Holy Lands Grand Elders shuddered, their faces filled with shock. Could it be that the Nine-Swords Paragon has returned? One of the Grand Elders asked in a trembling voice with an ugly expression. The Nine-Sword World was created by the Nine-Sword Paragon and was hidden in the depths of the void. Other than the Nine-Sword Paragon, other existences, even paragons, would have a hard time discovering it. Even though the ultimate experts could shatter the void and survive in the depths of the void was vast and boundless. To find the Nine Swords world with such precision was no different from looking for a needle in a haystack. It was precisely because of this that the Grand Elder doubted whether the Nine Swords supremacy had returned. Only a supreme expert of the Nine Swords could find the location of the Nine Swords world so easily and enter it. The Nine Swords supremacy. A trace of fear appeared on another Grand Elder's face. The Nine Sword Holy Land occupied the Holy Mountain, and was known as the Holy Land of the Nine Sword Supremacy's inheritance. But in reality, the Nine Sword Holy Land only occupied the Holy Mountain by force after the Nine Sword Supremacy left. If the Nine Sword Supremacy really returned, the first thing he would do would be to settle the score with the Nine Sword Holy Land. It's over. The third Grand Elder's face turned ashen. They were only true realm Earth immortals, not even Divine Ruin's realm. How could they defeat the Nine Swords Supremacy? It's not the Nine Swords Paragon. The Nine Sword Holy Master took a deep breath, glanced at the other pale-faced Grand Elders, and shook his head. Even a void-shattering realm paragon could only live for 5,000 years, Shoyuan. Once 5,000 years passed, even if the body didn't decay, the primordial spirit would also deteriorate. Perhaps the legendary primordial spirit paragon could exceed the limit of 5,000 years, but it was impossible for them to live for 50,000 years. Moreover, if the Nine Swords Supremacy really returned, the entire Holy Mountain should have risen and returned to the Nine Swords Supremacy's palm. According to the ancient records of the Nine Sword Holy Land's countless ancestors, the Nine Swords Supremacy had refined the entire Holy Mountain into a supreme treasure. Even if the Nine Sword Holy Land refined it continuously for 50,000 years, they had only refined less than 1/10,000th of the Holy Mountain's periphery. Even so, the Nine Sword Holy Land relied on this to dominate the world for 50,000 years. It's not the Nine Swords Supremacy? The few Grand Elders looked at each other and heaved a sigh of relief. As long as it wasn't the Nine Swords Supremacy, they could still salvage the situation. Could it be that some supreme expert coincidentally discovered the Nine Swords realm? Another Grand Elder of the Holy Land guessed. The Nine Sword Holy Master hesitated for a while and said slowly, "It shouldn't be the Paragon. Take a look for yourselves." The Nine Sword Holy Land's gaze shifted slightly and looked at the divine sword before them again. At this moment, the Nine Sword Holy Master raised his right hand and tapped on the sword solemnly. Suddenly, the entire divine sword suddenly let out a sword chime. Immediately after, rays of light appeared on the sword and gradually, images appeared before everyone's eyes. These images started from the front to the back and rapidly expanded in a certain direction. It was as though a scene that was extremely far away was being reflected on it. Soon, a huge and majestic palace appeared on the image. Behind the palace there was a dark void passage. Void passage. It's a void passage. It's indeed the aura of the outer realm. When the few Grand Elders saw this, their hearts started to beat faster. Since the void passage had appeared, it meant that if they followed the void passage, they would be able to leave the Nine Swords world. This was an unprecedented hope for the land immortals who were stuck at the true realm. And this huge and majestic palace, it should be a supreme treasure? It's not a supreme treasure. The aura of a supreme treasure can shake the heavens and earth. This should be a large-scale or even super-large-scale spatial Dharma treasure. The Grand Elder from the Sacred Land who spoke first said solemnly, generally speaking, large-scale spatial Dharma treasures were comparable to supreme treasures. As for super-large-scale spatial Dharma treasures, they were not even comparable to the life treasures of supreme experts. So what if it's a super-large-scale spatial Dharma treasure? Can it block the observation of the divine sword? A white-browed Grand Elder from the Sacred Land snorted coldly and said, after discovering the Void Passage, the Grand Elders from the Sacred Land also realized that the person who had sneaked into the Nine Swords world was not an Supreme Expert. And Supreme Expert could shatter the void with a wave of his hand. There was no need for a Void Passage, let alone the protection of a super large-scale spatial Dharma treasure to pass through the Void Passage. I think we've been overthinking. If it's really an Supreme Expert, the entire Nine Swords world would have already submitted to him. Under his vast aura, why would he let us discuss it here? The more the Grand Elders from the Sacred Land talked, the more confident they became. In their opinion, it should be some lucky person who had discovered the Void Passage and entered the Nine Swords world through the Void Passage. With the foundation of the Nine Swords world, even if they encountered a land immortal in the Divine Ruin realm, they would still be able to withstand a few blows. As for those below the Divine Ruin realm, they did not even care about them. Let's see which lucky one has brought us the Void Tunnel. The Grand Elders from the Sacred Land continued to watch the images. At this moment, images kept appearing. Finally, two figures appeared in the images. Of the two figures, one was tall and slender, while the other was standing there respectfully as though he was answering a question. It's him. Even the Nine Swords Sacred Master's eyes were focused on the tall and slender figure. Just as the Nine Swords Sacred Master and the Grand Elders from the Sacred Land were looking at the tall and slender figure, the tall and slender figure seemed to have sensed something. The tall and slender figure seemed to have sensed something. He raised his head slightly, and his eyes were deep as he looked towards them. Instantly, the Nine Swords Sacred Master and the Grand Elders from the Sacred Land felt as though they were looking at a pair of eyes that were as vast as the world. Under the gaze of this pair of eyes, everyone's mind, including the Nine Swords Sacred Master, quickly fell into darkness. Wang! In an instant, the divine sword started to vibrate violently again. Scene after scene continued to collapse and shatter into pieces. When the images completely collapsed, the Nine Swords Sacred Master and the others suddenly regained their senses. Their faces turned pale as shock filled their faces. Chapter 361. Nine Swords Sacred Mountain. The divine sword, which had been constantly releasing layers of light screens and displaying the scenes from hundreds of thousands or even millions of miles away, suddenly began to shake violently. Then, countless images rapidly collapsed and dissipated. In an instant, everyone was dead silent. From Nine Swords Sacred Master to the Grand Elders of the Sacred Grounds, everyone was dumbfounded and in disbelief. This divine sword was passed down by the Nine Swords Sacred Master Jiu Li. The reason why the Nine Swords Sacred Ground could dominate the world and even start to refine the outer area of the Sacred Mountain was because of the power of this divine sword. The divine sword had a spirit. If it used the Sacred Mountain, it could see every corner of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground instantly. Of course, doing so would consume a lot of energy for Nine Swords Sacred Master. But since there was an aura from the outside world, Nine Swords Sacred Master naturally didn't care about that. However, no one expected the divine sword to collapse just as it was about to reveal the appearance of the person who came. How was that possible? The Grand Elders of the Sacred Grounds were puzzled. However, Nine Swords Sacred Master looked solemn as if he had guessed something. It's a nascent soul secret technique. This person used a nascent soul secret technique to stop the divine sword from observing. Nine Swords Sacred Master paused for a moment and continued. If the divine sword didn't stop moving by itself, I'm afraid we would be in big trouble. After hearing that, the other Grand Elders of the Sacred Grounds turned pale again. The Nine Swords Saint Master was right. If the image hadn't suddenly collapsed, their minds would have already sunk into that pair of deep and serene eyes. How could they still be talking? That's terrifying. Is this the nascent soul secret technique that the nine-sword sacred master mentioned? The Grand Elder with white eyebrows broke out in cold sweat. Compared to domains and dermic powers, nascent soul secret techniques were invisible and impossible to guard against. They could even kill someone from 1,000 miles away just by using a medium. Although Su Qin's gaze wasn't that exaggerated, it was obvious that even Nine-Sword Sacred Master was terrified, let alone the other Grand Elders. The second Grand Elder said slowly, however, we should be able to confirm that this person is only an Earth Immortal. At most, he's a special Earth Immortal of the nascent soul lineage. If the person who came was really an Earth Immortal, he should have already torn the void and arrived at Nine-Sword Sacred Mountain the moment he was seen. Not bad. Although Earth Immortals of the primordial soul lineage are terrifying, they are not unstoppable. Another Supreme Elder spoke up. If one didn't know beforehand and encountered an Earth Immortal of the primordial soul division, even the Nine-Sword Saint Master would be at a disadvantage. However, now that he knew that the opponent was an expert of the primordial soul division, he should be more relaxed after making preparations. Although Essence Spirit secret skills were said to be unfathomable, they were not invincible. There were even some primordial spirit killer moves that could kill 1,000 enemies at the cost of 800 of oneself. For example, the Essence Soul Killer move Su Qin obtained from signing in at Myriad Sword Island, the Heart Sword technique. It transformed the power of the Essence Soul into a Heart Sword and controlled it to kill the enemy. If he could successfully slay his opponent's soul, then everything would be fine. However, if he failed and the sword was damaged, then Su Qin's soul would suffer a backlash as well. In the best-case scenario, his soul would wither, and in the worst-case scenario, his soul would collapse. Of course, the Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, did not have such a flaw. Abyss of Darkness did not condense the power of one's essence soul into an object. Instead, it formed an illusory world of the essence soul in one sea of consciousness and used this illusory world to guide the minds of others. As an ultimate technique of the primordial soul lineage, even if it failed, it would not affect Su Qin much. The sacred mountain was left behind by an expert. Once we hide in a high place, no matter how powerful the essence soul secret skill is, it should be useless against us. Nine-Sword Saint Master nodded slightly. The sacred mountain under their feet was thousands of meters tall. It was refined by the Nine Swords omnipotent master Zhou Li at a great cost 50,000 years ago. Even though it was not as good as the 9 swords behind Zhou Li, it was still stronger than ordinary natal true treasures. It might not be able to completely block Essence Soul Killer moves, but it could at least weaken the power of Essence Soul Killer moves by 99%. What do we do now? The Void Tunnel is there. Should we go over? Another Supreme Elder said in a deep voice. The people present were all true Realm Land Immortals. The temptation of the Void Tunnel was too great for them. It was equivalent to the hope of advancing further. No hurry. Paragon 9 Sword did not leave behind any primordial soul cardinal treasure. If we go out rashly, which one of you has the confidence to block his primordial soul secret skill? Saint Master 9 Sword glanced at the few Grand Elders and asked nonchalantly. When the several Supreme Elders heard this, their expressions immediately changed. Even if they knew that the other party was proficient in Essence Soul secret skills, so what? There were only 2 ways to block Essence Soul secret skills. One was to rely on the protection of the true treasures. The other was to resist it head-on. If they resisted, they would survive. If they could not, they would die. The Supreme Elders present did not have the confidence to block that pair of eyes that were as deep as the world. As for the true treasures, the entire 9-sword sacred ground did not have many true treasures. If they lost one, they would have one less. How could they allow a Supreme Elder to bring a true treasure out? Then what do we do? The Supreme Elder with white eyebrows said unwillingly. The other Supreme Elders also frowned slightly. It was obvious that they were unwilling as well. If the Void Tunnel had never appeared, they would not have any other emotions. After all, countless geniuses from the sacred grounds and immortal sects had died in the origin returning realm in the past 50,000 years. But now that the Void Tunnel had truly appeared in front of them, who could resist the temptation? Don't worry. This person will probably take the initiative to come to our 9-sword sacred ground. When that happens, we will rely on the power of the sacred mountain to meet this essence soul true world expert. Nine-Sword Saint Master's eyes flickered as he spoke. The Nine-Sword Sacred Mountain was the absolute core of the entire Nine-Sword Sacred Ground. It even had the inheritance of a supreme expert. Nine-Sword Saint Master did not believe that the other party would not be interested at all. Outside the void tunnel, Su Qin was listening to Daoist Chunyangzi's words. Suddenly, he raised his head slightly and looked in a certain direction. Interesting. A smile appeared on Su Qin's face. With his strength, he naturally sensed the feeling of being spied on at the first moment. Compared to the demon god's eyes in the immortal sex, this feeling of being spied on was extremely weak. Because of this, Su Qin directly followed this feeling of being spied on, and used his Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, to retaliate. Compared to other Essence Soul Killer moves, Abyss of Darkness was even more bizarre. It could kill with one's gaze and was extremely unbelievable. What a pity. It was blocked by other forces in the end. Su Qin shook his head slightly as he thought to himself. In fact, Su Qin was not disappointed. The Essence Soul Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, was powerful, but it could not kill several experts of the same level from hundreds of thousands of li away. In Su Qin's opinion, even if there were no other forces blocking it, Abyss of Darkness would not be able to do anything to the other party. At most, it could make the other party immerse themselves in it for a moment. Senior, did something happen? Daoist Chunyangzi saw a strange smile on Su Qin's face and immediately asked uneasily. Nothing. Su Qin shook his head and said casually, follow me to the sacred mountain. Chapter 362. Sacred Mountain. It was the absolute core of the Nine Swords world. 50,000 years ago, when the Nine Swords Paragon Overlord Zhou Li established the Nine Swords world, he had cultivated in seclusion on the sacred mountain for a few hundred years before leaving and never appearing again. After the disappearance of the Nine Swords Paragon Overlord, the ancestral masters of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground forcibly occupied the periphery of the sacred mountain and established the Nine Swords Sacred Ground. They claimed to be the inheritance of the Nine Swords Paragon Overlord and dominated the entire Nine Swords world for 50,000 years. It wasn't that no one had ever thought of rebelling against the Nine Swords Sacred Ground's rule, but they all failed. Even though the Nine Swords Sacred Ground only had a few tricks of the Nine Swords Paragon Overlord, it wasn't something the living beings of the Nine Swords world could resist. Senior, you want to go to the sacred mountain? Pure Sun's eyes widened in disbelief when he heard this. In Daoist Pure Sun's eyes, Su Qin was indeed very strong. With just a wave of his hand, he had turned the two disciples of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground into nothingness like ants. But if Su Qin looked down on the entire Nine Swords Sacred Ground and the Holy Mountain because of this, then it was really inappropriate. What kind of place was the sacred mountain? It was where the Nine Swords Paragon Overlord used to cultivate in seclusion. Not to mention the many tricks left in the depths of the sacred mountain. The power of the Nine Swords Sacred Ground alone was enough to defeat a group of true realm earth deities. Only the sacred mountain interests me in the entire Nine Swords world. Su Qin looked calmly in a certain direction and said softly. Su Qin used the War God Temple to go through the passage and came to the Nine Swords world. His most important goal was to sign in there. The Nine Swords world had existed for at least tens of thousands of years. Even if it wasn't in the mortal world, the Taoist connotation accumulated over the years was much more than the Chong and Palace. According to Su Qin's guess, only the Gate of Heaven and a few other places could compare. However, even if the Nine Swords world was only created by the Nine Swords Paragon Overlord, it was still extremely vast. It was the size of dozens of the Empire of Tang. If Su Qin were to search inch by inch, it would take at least a few months or years. Therefore, Su Qin didn't bother searching and planned to go to the sacred mountain directly. Given the location of the holy mountain, most of the Dao accumulations of the entire Nine Swords realm would be gathered there. If one were to sign in there, they would definitely reap great rewards. As for the other locations of the Nine Swords world, when Su Qin had enough time in the future, he would find them one by one. After all, the void passage between the Nine Swords world and the human world had already been formed. At least in this Vitality Tide era, Su Qin had plenty of time to digest the harvest of the Nine Swords world. Senior, the holy mountain isn't an ownerless place. Daoist Pure Sun hesitated. He was not worried about Su Qin's safety, but rather, once Su Qin fell to the sacred mountain as a guide, he would not have a good ending. The Nine-Sword Holy Land would immediately deal with him. It's all right. I know what to do, Su Qin said indifferently. The Nine Swords world was not like the immortal world. The world of immortals was created by the supreme experts as a place to store their holy land of inheritance. Under the influence of the supreme experts, not only were there earth immortals at the divine ruin realm, but the supreme experts had also spread out their bloodlines before they passed away, creating one direct bloodline descendant after another who was invincible in the divine ruin realm. The Nine Swords world was different. When the Nine Swords world was created by the omnipotent expert Zhou Li to his heart's content, he did not specially draw in the great Tao law fragments. Furthermore, even if the omnipotent expert Zhou Li had really drawn in the great Tao law fragments, after 50,000 years, they would have disappeared. Only 10,000 years had passed in the immortal world, but the great path law had almost disappeared, let alone 50,000 years in the Nine Swords world. Under the premise that they could not comprehend the great path law, the cultivation of an earth immortal would stop at the true realm at most. In other words, the strongest person in the Nine Swords world was only an earth immortal of the true realm. In fact, this was the same as the result of Su Qin using the Eye of Truth to observe the Nine Swords world. Under the premise that there were no divine ruins realm land immortals, Su Qin was naturally fearless. With the many trump cards and methods he had now, even if he encountered a real divine ruins realm land immortal, he could still fight for a while, let alone the Nine Swords world, which did not even have a divine ruins realm land immortal. Of course, although Su Qin was confident, he would not ignore the Nine Swords world. After all, this was a world created by the supreme expert of the Nine Swords world. If the other party left behind a backup plan, Su Qin would probably be at a disadvantage. However, Su Qin knew that no matter how strong the supreme expert of the Nine Swords world was, as long as he did not exceed the void-shattering realm, even if he left behind a real killing move after 50,000 years, its power would probably be less than 10%. Even if it was a threat to Su Qin, it would not be fatal. Let's go. Su Qin glanced at Daoist Pure Sun and directly headed in a certain direction. The sudden feeling of being spied on made Su Qin directly lock onto the location of the Nine Swords Sacred Mountain. Yes. Seeing this, Daoist Pure Sun immediately gritted his teeth and followed. At this moment, Daoist Pure Sun had no other choice. After seeing Su Qin's methods, he did not even have the thought of running away. What kind of joke was this? The aura that Su Qin had just displayed, that feeling of looking down on everything in this world, in Daoist Pure Sun's eyes, perhaps only the Nine Swords Sacred Lord and the Supreme Elders could compare. Running away in front of such an existence was simply courting death. As for what would happen after going to the Sacred Mountain, Daoist Pure Sun no longer had any scruples. Even if Su Qin was suppressed by the Nine Swords Sacred Ground and he would be punished by the Nine Swords Sacred Ground, that was something that would happen in the future. Right now, what Daoist Pure Sun needed to do the most was not to anger Su Qin. The supreme expert of the Nine Swords world is truly amazing. Su Qin carefully sensed it, and a look of surprise appeared on his face. In Su Qin's perception, the entire Nine Swords world faintly revealed a sword intent. Although this sword intent was extremely faint, as if it had been there for 50,000 years, it did not dissipate and instead filled the void. Su Qin understood that this was the aura left behind by the supreme expert of the Nine Swords world when he established it. Only an existence like the supreme expert of the Nine Swords world who could shatter the void with the sword Tao could extend his aura for 50,000 years. From a certain perspective, Su Qin observing and comprehending the entire Nine Swords world was equivalent to experiencing the path taken by the supreme expert of the Nine Swords world 50,000 years ago. For other earthly immortals, especially those of the Sword Tao lineage, it would be like obtaining a supreme treasure. Unfortunately, Su Qin's path was not the Sword Tao, so the Nine Swords world created by the supreme expert of the Nine Swords world only slightly touched him. Senior, the sacred mountain is up ahead. While Su Qin was immersed in his comprehension, Daoist Pure Sun's voice cautiously sounded. The sacred mountain? Su Qin calmed his mind and slightly raised his head to look at the vast sacred mountain that had stood there for 50,000 years like a divine sword. Chapter 363. The holy mountain was majestic, vaguely resembling a world-shaking divine sword. Even someone as strong as Su Qin had a solemn expression, not daring to underestimate it. Even after a long time, Su Qin could still feel an extremely sharp aura flowing in the depths of the holy mountain. If it weren't for the fact that the Supreme Nine Li was in existence from 50,000 years ago, the Shoyuan should have been exhausted long ago, and Su Qin wouldn't have been able to enter the Nine-Sword World so easily. So this is the holy mountain, the place where the supreme powerhouse of the Nine-Sword World went into seclusion. Compared to Su Qin's calm expression, Taoist Pure Sun beside him was filled with emotion. As the only core of the Nine-Sword World, the Nine-Sword Holy Land had relied on the holy mountain to suppress the world for 50,000 years. Countless beings wanted to see the holy mountain with their own eyes. Unfortunately, ever since the Nine-Sword Holy Land occupied the holy mountain, they prohibited anyone from entering within 10,000 miles of the holy mountain. If it weren't for Su Qin, how could Taoist Pure Sun have come here? He would have probably been suppressed by the patrolling disciples of the holy mountain. At this moment, countless disciples of the Nine-Sword Holy Land appeared on the holy mountain and looked at Su Qin. The news of the two disciples of the Nine-Sword World falling, and the appearance of an outsider had long spread throughout the Nine-Sword Holy Land. The Holy Master and the Grand Elders had no intention of hiding it from the disciples. After all, the Nine-Sword Holy Land was determined to obtain the Void Passage. Coupled with the degree of control they had over the Nine-Sword World, there was no need to hide it. Is he the outer realm being that the Sacred Master mentioned? An outsider. I didn't expect there to be another world besides our Nine-Sword World. It seems that this outsider is no different from us. Why are the Holy Master and Grand Elders so serious? Countless disciples of the Holy Land discussed secretly. Even if the Nine-Sword Holy Land had records of the outside world, to the disciples of the Nine-Sword World who had lived there for generations, it was no different from myths and legends. When they saw it with their own eyes, it was easy to imagine the disbelief in their hearts. What do you think this outsider has? Can he block our Nine-Sword Holy Land's divine sword sky? Some disciples of the Holy Land asked with interest. Since Su Qin had come to the Holy Mountain in such a grandiose manner, coupled with the orders of the Holy Master and the various Grand Elders, the countless Holy Land disciples present naturally realized that there would be a battle between Su Qin and the Nine Swords Holy Land. This battle was related to the biggest change in the Nine Sword Holy Ground's history in the last 50,000 years. If they won, the Nine Sword Holy Ground might be able to break free from the shackles of the Nine Sword World. Who knows? However, my Nine Sword Holy Land has the foundation left behind by a supreme powerhouse. We are not afraid of anyone. Although the other disciple had a worried look on his face, he quickly recovered and said confidently, "The 9999 Sword World's holy land. The Nine Sword Holy Land. Was the 99 Holy Land 9 world. Of the 9 to the 9999 Sword 9 world to the 999 world. What should we do now? Do you need us to suppress them? Choose two to fight. Don't be hasty. We'll have to wait for the Holy Master's orders," a woman with a veil on her face said softly. Holy Master. The Holy Land disciple fell silent for a while. He suppressed his boiling battle intent and did not continue speaking. The Nine Sword Holy Master was in charge of the Nine Sword Holy Land. Before the Nine Sword Holy Master made a decision, how could these disciples dare to act rashly? At the same time, deep in the Nine Sword Holy Land, the Nine Sword Holy Master and the Grand Elders sat cross-legged and looked at Su Qin at the same time. Sacred Master, he's the existence that crossed the spatial tunnel and entered our Nine Swords world? A Supreme Elder's face flashed with shock as he muttered to himself. The other Grand Elders were the same. When Su Qin first entered the Nine Sword world, the Nine Sword Holy Master and the other Grand Elders had already noticed him. However, the Nine Sword Holy Master tried to spy on Su Qin with the power of the Divine Sword but failed in the end. Therefore, this was the first time the Grand Elders saw Su Qin with their own eyes. He's very strong. A divine sword vaguely appeared in the Nine Sword Holy Master's hand. He stared at Su Qin for a while before muttering to himself, "He's very strong? The other Grand Elders' faces changed at the same time. They knew how prideful the Nine-Sword Holy Master was. Even among the past Holy Masters, the current Nine-Sword Holy Master could be ranked in the top 3 or even first. If it wasn't for the restriction of heaven and earth, the Nine-Sword Holy Master would have broken through the shackles of the true realm and entered the legendary ruins of God. Now that the Nine-Sword Holy Master took the initiative to say, "He's very strong," one could imagine how highly he thought of Su Qin. "Don't worry." The Nine-Sword Holy Master glanced at the Grand Elders and shook his head. "Although he's very strong, he hasn't entered the ruins of God." The land immortals were divided into 3 levels: Spirit Severing, True Realm, and Ruins of God. The land immortals in the ruins of God had already started to touch the power of space. Even those at the pinnacle of the ruins of God had started to comprehend the power of space. Although they were still far from being able to break through the void, the aura that connected with the vast void was extremely eye-catching. Therefore, the Nine-Sword Holy Master was sure that Su Qin hadn't entered the ruins of God yet, because he didn't feel the power of space from Su Qin. "He hasn't entered the ruins of God." The Grand Elders looked at each other and heaved a sigh of relief in their hearts. Although the ruins of God was the last realm of the land immortals, there was a huge gap in this realm, especially those who were invincible in the ruins of God. From a certain perspective, they had already grasped the means of an ultimate expert. It was unbelievable. For example, some direct descendants who had awakened the bloodline of an ultimate expert could sweep through all the ruins of God with their natal cardinal treasure. Humph! A mere true realm cultivator dares to come to our Nine-Sword Holy Master. He's simply courting death. Another Grand Elder of the Holy Land said with a cold expression, "Enough. There's no need to say anything else." The Nine-Sword Holy Master didn't underestimate Su Qin. He raised his right hand and tapped lightly. In an instant, a divine sword that was as bright as heaven and earth appeared. This divine sword was majestic, and its terrifying sword intent instantly filled every corner of the holy mountain. Divine sword. The Holy Master is going to use the divine sword. The other Grand Elders were shocked. This divine sword was one of the few treasures left behind by the ultimate expert of the Nine-Sword Holy Master. The Nine-Sword Holy Master had used this divine sword to control the periphery of the holy mountain and monitor the world. When Su Qin first entered the Nine-Sword world, he was detected by this divine sword. Although Su Qin used his Essence Spirit Killer move, Abyss of Darkness, to block the divine sword's detection, one had to know that this divine sword's main purpose wasn't to detect but to attack. Logically speaking, as one of the trump cards of the Nine-Sword Holy Master, it should be used at the last moment. However, the Nine-Sword Holy Master had activated the divine sword's power at the first moment. Buzz! As the divine sword's power continued to recover, a layer of unimaginable terror suddenly pressed down on the cloudless sky. The surrounding 10,000 miles turned into a boundless sword domain. Just as the divine sword's aura continued to rise, outside the holy mountain, Su Qin's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise. He's using the method left behind by the ultimate expert, Nine Li, so quickly? You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.